The January 16th work session of the Williams County Board of Education. We will begin with our consent agenda. I'm not going to read through the individual items, but you've had the agenda for a few days. Do you see anything you want to discuss on the consent agenda? Okay, don't see any items there, so we'll move ahead with that. And we'll, as always, vote on that as a block on Tuesday night. So we can move right into the superintendent's report, and just fair warning, Jason already gave me the heads up. This will be potentially a lengthy discussion because of the two subjects that are being discussed, or maybe three, and some of the presentations that we have, which will be very useful and helpful, but could take a while. So let's just fair warning. All right, Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, board members. It's good to see you all. We had a little bit of a break during December, and we had a really good first semester. I want to give you just a couple of quick updates and then get into the meat of our discussion. We actually have one separate voting item on the entire agenda. That's open zone schools, and we'll get to that. So I believe the bulk of our time tonight is going to be spent on some reports. We're going to have some discussion from Maria Griego, who is our Director of Student Support Services, and it's kind of a primer on special education. And I want to tell you on the front end, it's a lot, and there's no way you're going to retain everything this first time, but we're going to let you have that PowerPoint, and we'll have some ongoing discussions as these months and years go by. One thing that struck me when Maria was preparing this is our special education teachers spend years learning all this, and we're going to try to fire hose it to you guys, at least to some extent. Second, we're going to give you an update on our science textbook selection process. If you may remember that Jennifer Sowers said something along the lines of last month, well, not a lot's happening right now, but when it does, it'll be fast, or some version of that. We're at that stage. And so she's going to give you an update on where we are with that. But before we do that, I want to call your attention to an article that we published about a week ago. Last week, the state released our ACT results, and I can't help but brag a little bit. We had the highest ACT score of any district in the state. And we also have a number of our schools that were in the top 10 statewide for ACT score. Our average ACT score is 25.2. That's more than a point higher than the next closest district. And so we're very proud of the work our teachers and our students did, and the support that our students have from their parents. And by the way, that was this past year's graduating class. So we're getting the information about 6 months in arrears. I also want to mention that particular class, 84% of them went straight to college. And we've had that discussion as well, really in the context of our career technical education programs. And I mentioned that, I think, when we broke ground for the Innovation Hub. And one of the items that I'm proud of is how we're making sure that no matter what our students are planning to do as their next steps, we are giving them the opportunities to look at business opportunities, giving them the opportunity to look at industry. And one of my favorite stories to tell these last few years is, it happens to be a Fairview story. Governor Lee came to visit our mechatronics program, and he happened upon two students who were working together on this conveyor belt structure that was shifting based on the nature of the product that rolled down the conveyor belt, and it was separating product. And he asked the two students what they were going to do after high school. And one of them said, I'm going to Georgia Tech, I want to be a mechanical engineer. And the other one said, I'm going straight into industry, I'm getting a certification in electrical. And they were working together in our schools. And just stories like that abound. And so the ACT is another example of those doors we're opening for our students. And so again, we're very proud of that. And the state tracks what they call subpopulations. They track the performance of what they describe as Black, Hispanic, and Native American, economically disadvantaged English learners, and students with disabilities, and those numbers are pretty impressive as well, as we concentrate on, again, making sure we're opening doors for all our students. I'm going to give you one example. Our students with disabilities average ACT score exceeded the state average for all students, just one quick example. Now, the reality is, you're going to learn in just a minute, and I'm using this as a segue to Maria's presentation. When you look at aggregate information for students with disabilities, you're looking at it the wrong way. What you ought to be looking at is individual students and individual student performance. There's a structure that's designed for that, but we are emotionally committed and professionally committed to looking at it individually as well. Maria is going to give you that basic structure so that you can start getting an idea of where we are in Williamson County Schools with how we serve our students with disabilities. A large portion of this is going to be federal. A smaller portion of this will be state, and then there'll be a piece of that describing how we do our work within those parameters, within those guardrails that the federal and state rules give us. So with that, Maria, I'm going to turn it over to you, and she's going to share with you information related to that structure and how we apply it. And Maria, if you don't mind, I want to volunteer that if anyone has any question on the fly, it's okay to interrupt. Are you good with that? Okay. With a caveat, I may do the same thing.
All right, good evening. I guess I need to figure out the best spot to stand. I don't think I can hold the clicker, the microphone, and my notes. So I will kind of reference my notes back here, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. As Jason said, I'm Maria Griego, the Executive Director of what we call Student Support Services, or SSS, or SSS, in Williamson County Schools. And in Williamson County, SSS includes special education and 504. So tonight, we're going to delve into some of the timelines, some of the disability categories, how one becomes eligible to receive services. We're going to do a pretty high-level overview. So if anybody wants additional information about these topics, I can certainly provide that to you or have a discussion with you, but this is a pretty high level. To set the stage tonight, I want you to know that when we're talking about students that receive special education in 504, we're talking about a little over 25% of our total student population in WCS. And I have these figures on a graph for you, and they're in the PowerPoint, but I think it's important to know that as we begin our discussion. We have about 10,500 students combined with IEPs and 504s. So, and a large part of our general purpose budget goes to supporting students with disabilities. It's about $92 million that supports our students with disabilities. And that includes everything from teachers to materials to bus drivers to buses to all of the things in between that our students need in order to receive that education, that free appropriate public education. We do also get a small percentage of federal funds that support this work. It's about $12.1 million in federal funds compared with the $92 million that we have locally here. So I'm going to keep going, but I wanted you to kind of get the depth and breadth of the students that we're talking about tonight. So we're going to start off with special education discussion. So all students that receive special education services qualify for such services, and we use what's called the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It is a federal law, and that law ensures that our children with disabilities throughout the nation get the services that they need in order to access education. IDEA governs how those states and public agencies provide that early intervention, so our 3 to 5 year olds, our school-age students, and then our students all the way up in Tennessee to age 22. It also looks at our related services, so things like occupational therapy, speech therapy. Each state, in turn, is responsible for ensuring that school districts are in compliance with this federal law. We have monitoring that occurs in different facets annually that we're responsible to provide information to the state. You'll also see at the bottom of some of the slides that are kind of wordy, there's a little asterisk there, and it's just intended to be a little one-sentence summary of what was on that slide. Any questions so far? All right. So as far as IDEA goes, there are 4 key components that I wanted to point out to you guys tonight. The first one is what we lovingly call FAPE. We have an acronym for everything. So FAPE, LRE, IEP, and then procedural safeguards. We're going to delve a little bit more deeply into each of these. on the next slides. So FAPE is that free appropriate public education. And really what this premise is in the IDEA is that students with disabilities are to receive an education at no cost to their families that meet their needs. And it aims, the purpose is that students with disabilities have the same educational opportunities as their non-disabled peers. So that's really what that FAPE, or free appropriate public education, is looking at. The 4 key components of FAPE is free. It's an education at no cost, right? Public education, that's what students receive in public school. And then appropriate. So appropriate in this sense means that the education is tailored to meet the individual needs of the student. So I think Jason mentioned this earlier. When we're talking about special education, the things that we do are individualized for that specific student. So every student has their own plan, their own services, their own team. Public is next. The education is provided by the public school system, and then education, the services are designed to provide that educational benefit. All right, the second key principle under IDEA is what's called LRE, or least restrictive environment. And really what this is looking at is that we are educating students with disabilities alongside their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent appropriate for that student. And it looks different depending on the needs of each individual student. So sometimes that means that a student might be in a general education classroom the majority of their day. Sometimes it might mean it's a combination of a special education setting and a general education setting. So a graphic here just to kind of give you an idea of the least restrictive environment continuum. And so you'll see over here in the green, we start with our least restrictive, and then we go toward the blue, which gets more restrictive as you go. So obviously general education alongside their peers is the least restrictive, all the way down to a homebound or hospital placement is the most restrictive on the right-hand side. We do have students that fall along all along this continuum in WCS. And school districts are required to provide services at every part of the continuum based on individual student need. Any questions on FAPE or LRE? All right, the third big component of IDEA is the Individualized Education Program. Many of you have heard IEP meeting. That is the document, the program that each student's team designs to tailor what the student needs in order to provide them with a FAPE and in the least restrictive environment. Okay? So it is that legal document that lists all of the students' present levels, their goals, their services. The IEP process is collaborative. So no one person can sit and develop an IEP. Okay? It's intended to be parents and educators and administrators coming together to develop the best plan possible for students. So another slide on the IEP. The IEP team, which I have a little graphic to the right there showing you typical members of an IEP team. Obviously other people can be invited as needed, but these are kind of your typical members. The parents, the general ed teacher, the special ed teacher, the LEA representative, all of those are required members. And that team is responsible to develop the IEP, to revise it when it's needed, and at least annually they have to revise it. And then anytime a parent or another team member, a teacher, administrator, feels the need that something needs to be revised in that document, the team is responsible for coming together and making any revisions needed.
So a couple things I want to point out on this chart with the required members. For example, if a student needs occupational therapy services, the occupational therapist would be a member of the team. If the student needs different services, that particular somebody with that expertise is a member of the team. Also, in the interest of filling in the acronyms, the LEA, that's the local education agency, and from the way I process that one is, that is the person who has the capacity to bind the school district, to commit the school district to the services that the IEP team is talking about.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, the LEA representative is typically the school's assistant principal or principal, and that's typically who is that LEA representative at each meeting. All right. Oh, you have a question? Sure.
Yeah. Do we ever have to outsource treatment? We don't have that specialty in the central staff, so we have to contract with somebody who's certified, licensed or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes. Sometimes we have to contract for different services, oftentimes not to provide the entire education, sometimes. But for example, sometimes we've had to contract for vision services, something along those lines. We do have our own staff, but sometimes if we have a vacancy or we have more students, that an influx of students, sometimes we do contract those services.
And so also, if you think back to Maria's slide with that continuum from in a general education setting all the way to hospitalized, we do occasionally serve students who are in a residential facility, and that's contracted services as well. So there are some times that the students' disabilities are such that the least restrictive environment is outside of a school, and in that case, the free part applies. We will pay for that.
Leads to another question. A chemo student, chemotherapy, a
Yeah.
student with cancer, do the programs stop and start depending on whether they're having a good month or a bad month?
Yeah.
Given
Yeah.
their
That's a great
Yes.
question. So we provide homebound services for students who are medically unable to come to school. And so that is students with or without disabilities, not specific to having a disability. So a child going through cancer treatments, we offer homebound. We actually go to the hospitals. We have a team that goes to Vanderbilt, different places to provide education for those students. If it happens to be a student with an IEP, those services or the team decides on what that looks like, the frequency, the duration of those services. If the child is just too ill to participate, I mean, the parents certainly can let us know, and we will resume when they're medically able.
And often those include some pretty deep conversations with the doctors about what the student has the capacity to manage.
That's a great question. All right, so the next thing is procedural safeguards. This is the last of the four big pillars or components, if you will, of IDEA. And the procedural safeguards, I think the easiest way to explain them is that they are the rights that children with disabilities and their parents have. So these rights are under the IDEA, and they are actually a 42-page booklet. So if you've ever attended an IEP meeting, it's a large document that is provided to parents. The legal requirement is that it be provided at least annually. Our practice really is to offer it at each IEP meeting to ensure that parents know what their rights are and that they have the opportunity to ask questions that we can explain if they don't know what their rights are. And so the booklet has a lot of information. It also has resources for families that the state has put together in the back.
So I want to mention something related to that 42-page thing. So we have conversations along these lines. You know, our teachers have been working on this professionally. Sometimes a parent comes in for what you're going to see in a little bit related to eligibility, where they're starting that process. And we have had these conversations. We want to make sure that it's tough. A parent might have a 42-page rights document just plopped down in front of them, and it can be overwhelming. I just visualize that. It's a lot. And so part of what Maria is going to walk through is the process we go through, but we are constantly reminding ourselves, see it from the parent's perspective. This can be very difficult. And so that empathy is a very important component that we constantly emphasize because it truly can be overwhelming.
I have a question. Is that booklet digital? Is there a way for people to download it from the website?
Yes. Maria?
It's not on the website, but you can actually put in Tennessee procedural safeguards and it'll pop up. And we often, if parents want it digitally, we provide it that way as well.
It's on the state website.
It is.
But that might be something that we think
Yeah.
about adding a link.
Yeah, we
That's a
know.
good suggestion.
For parents tend to have a pretty good idea if their child's going to need a 504 or IEP, and so at least that's something they could access in advance of a meeting, initial meeting.
Sure, that's something we could certainly do.
I was going to ask something kind of along the same lines. I would love to get, I had a child with an IEP, and I remember that, but I would love to see that document now.
Yeah.
there's a way we could get that, that would be great.
Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely.
We'll make sure to get
I
it
can
to
get
you.
it to Jason. Mhm. All right. Great questions. So now we've kind of gone through, okay, the IDEA is the federal law. Then we've got the components of IDEA. Now we're going to get a little bit deeper and we're going to talk about special education eligibility, or how one qualifies. And then what is our responsibility to identify students with disabilities? So the first bullet there is what's called child find. And that really means that our responsibility is to seek out and offer evaluations for any student that is suspected of having a disability. If you have students in the system, you probably have gotten the principal's email, and there are blurbs at certain times through the year that go out in the school's emails. It's on our website. We put brochures in doctor's offices and daycare centers and all over to ensure that people in our community know that we are here and we provide resources. Same goes for in our schools, right? Every year our schools get a presentation on what is child find. As educators, what is their responsibility if they suspect one of their students has a disability? The same goes for parents. If they suspect a disability, we need to be responsive to that and make sure we meet and address concerns and do an evaluation if one is warranted. Who is eligible and who we serve? A lot of people don't know this, but special education actually serves students that are ages 3 to 22 in Tennessee. So we do evaluations on students before their 3rd birthday, so that once they turn 3, they can start receiving special education services if they qualify. And then students who have not earned a general education diploma have the ability to continue working on it until they're 22, or to remain in school to receive transition and related services until their 22nd birthday. So we do, our numbers that you see tonight, and the numbers that I gave you do include students from ages 3 to 22.
So let me give you a little bit of detail related to that. So 3 and 4-year-olds, preschool students, we call them early childhood. We call that program our early childhood program. Generally speaking, across the state, they're going to say, they're going to differentiate between voluntary pre-K and pre-K. So when you hear pre-K or pre-K for students with disabilities at a state meeting, that's what we describe as early childhood. We have a responsibility to educate those children with peers who do not have IEPs. And so we have a 1-to-1 ratio, 50-50, and we talk with the state regular. I know Maria's team does about that ratio. And that program, from a timing perspective, is generally structured with half a day, 4 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. So our teachers are with a cohort in the morning, the buses run in midday, and another cohort comes in the afternoon for those 3 and 4-year-olds. So that's kind of the basics of that. Early childhood is not included in TISA funding. And so you may hear that. That's been a big discussion just the last year or so related to the new TISA funding. So that's one side of it. The other piece I wanted to mention related to our students who are 22 years old, they can stay in the program until the end of the school year that they turn 22. So the moment they turn 3, they can come. If it happens to be October 12th, they can come October 12th if they have a disability. So we're constantly addressing birthdays. But we will provide services to those students. They could be theoretically 22 and a half when the school year ends. So I just wanted you guys to be aware of that. They don't leave the program the moment they turn 22. They're able to finish the school year.
That's right. Thank you. The other thing is who is eligible and who we serve, so ages 3 to 22, and then also the student will need to meet eligibility criteria that our state has set forth for one of 18 different educational disabilities in Tennessee. So up here, this is a lot of information on the slide, but I'm going to kind of orient you to how I have it laid out. On the left-hand side, you're going to see that IDEA acronym again. That is that Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that federal law. The disability categories that law sets out are on the left-hand side. There are 14 of those. Okay. On the right-hand side, we recognize all 14 of those. And then on the right side, Tennessee has added, well, I'm going to point out something first. The purple. You'll see on the left-hand side, you see speech and language impairment is one combined disability under IDEA. Tennessee actually separates it out into speech impairments and language impairments. Same way with visual impairment. You'll see in the red on the left-hand side, IDEA recognizes that as one disability. Our state has separated it out into blind and visually impaired. Then, on top of that, Tennessee has 2 state-specific disability areas. One of those is intellectually gifted, and we're one of about 7 or 8, don't quote me on the number, states that recognize students that are intellectually gifted as needing an IEP. And then the other one is an eligibility category called functional delay. And last I checked, we're the only state in the nation that had this disability category. Dennis.
What do we do for the intellectually gifted?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in order to qualify for having a disability, you have to meet the numbers part, the criteria that the state sets forth. That's one prong. The second prong of qualification is that it has to negatively impact your education. So the same holds true for students that are gifted. So it has to impact their education. So what they are getting, for example, in the general education classroom doesn't meet their needs. Their needs are so much greater than the content that they are needing. They need additional opportunities. Sometimes that also comes with some social skills needs, some transition needs as they prepare for life after high school, and things like that. So, yeah. All right. Oh, any other questions about disability categories? I have some data at the end of the presentation that kind of shows you by disability category how many students we have.
Well, to that
Maria.
point, while it's handy, you're going to see it later, but 2,031 students in WCS have IEPs for intellectually gifted. 2,000.
Maria, are any of these state, well, I guess, or federal categories recent ones that have been added in the law, or have all these been around for quite some time?
I think since I've been a psychologist, so that's, yeah, it's been a while.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's a great question.
Where does dyslexia fall? Would it be specific learning disability, or is it not?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Dyslexia?
Dyslexia. So it isn't a disability in special education law specifically, but where it would fall for student is under specific learning disability. So typically, and I have a note there out to the side, it says specific academic area noted. So one could have a specific learning disability in basic reading, which is typically where dyslexia falls, or reading comprehension, or math calculation, or written expression. There are several areas that one could have a specific learning disability in. That's
Well,
a great question.
and Maria doesn't have a plan to get into the details of our responsibilities related to dyslexia, but that has changed in recent years.
Absolutely.
At
And,
the state
and
level.
not related to special education
That's right.
necessarily. Yeah.
And it's not called dyslexia, what's it called?
Specific learning disability and basic reading.
Okay.
Maria, real quick, do you have a breakdown of the 10,500 students that we have? It's like how many IEPs, 504s, and then like I'd love to see just even the gifted versus everything else. Really, I mean, I don't care about how many of each of these really.
I do have it in the presentation.
Okay, great.
Yep, that's a
Slide
great
23.
question. It's coming. Okay, anything else related to eligibility categories? Okay. The next thing is steps in the eligibility and IEP process. And I'm not going to go into depth about each of these, but I wanted you to see that there are many, many times that we meet and review and support parents and students along this process. The very first thing is written consent for an evaluation. Before a child can ever be determined to be eligible for special education, a parent has to give us written consent to do that evaluation. That typically in our schools is done through something called a general referral meeting, and I like to refer to it as a problem-solving team, where parents, school team members come together because they've identified a weakness or a problem, and they want to figure out how to solve it. That doesn't always result in an evaluation for special education, but it might. Sometimes it results in intervention. Sometimes it results in, I'm going to move so Drayson can sit. Sometimes it results in an evaluation for special ed or 504, or sometimes more intervention or support from another area in the school. Then we go through the evaluation process. Then we have an eligibility meeting to determine whether the child is eligible. After that, parents have 14 days to make a decision, whether they agree with the decision that the child is eligible or whether they don't. During that time, they're welcome to ask questions, review our reports, come in and meet with us again. Then we go to, after the child is determined eligible, let's say they were in this sense, then we go to that initial IEP meeting. And at that IEP meeting is where we're making our proposal for what goals, services, accommodations, and so forth the student will need. After we make that proposal, a parent again has 14 calendar days to make their decision. Also, each year, students get quarterly progress reports.
Maria, I'm going to interrupt right there, and Maria's going to give you a little bit of drill down detail in the next few slides about some of these processes. But one of the things that we've talked about is, especially for a parent who's new to this, it can feel like, oh my goodness, I've got to make a decision right now. But the structure does have those time periods in there, and so that's a common concern that I've heard over time. It has a potential to feel overwhelming. The federal guidelines are, for us, are a timing perspective. They're designed to give time in between all those. They're fast in some ways because of some of the data you have to collect and some of the tests you have to do. But then in other contexts, they're designed to give some window of time for parents to make decisions. I may be overstepping, but this is just my impression after having known about these laws for the last 20 years. I believe they've largely been designed to make sure that schools don't drag their feet and things fall through the cracks with all these deadlines. But they do build time in for parents to make decisions. But again, I think a point of emphasis that we've talked about is a parent might not know that because they have that 42 pages, that they've just looked at maybe for the first time. So we've talked about trying to ensure that that's a point of emphasis. This is important. You don't have to make a decision today. You've got time.
Well, and that's a good segue, Jason, and I don't necessarily have this on a slide, but something that I did want to mention. We know, as Jason said, that it is a lot of information, right? It's a lot of information to hear that your child has a disability, right? That maybe they're not performing in the way that you hoped they would. And so we certainly want to make sure that we are understanding and that we are empathetic with families and parents. And so one of the things that we've been problem solving on my team is how do we condense? We can't not give the parents the whole procedural safeguards, right? That's not an option. We legally have to give it. But how can we let parents know on the front end, hey, you don't have to make a decision today, right? You've got time to take this information in, digest it, ask questions, follow up before you make a decision. So we're working on a process now, kind of a summary that will be very specific to tell the parent who they can contact about which topics while they're in that evaluation process, and then letting them know on the front end that you don't have to make decisions. You've got time. You don't have to make them in that meeting. Yeah.
So a couple things. So one thing, is it not just stated to them that they have this 14-day window?
We do tell them verbally, but I think also when you're hearing all of this information come at you, I don't know that they always know or understand what that means.
Gotcha.
Yep, that's a good question.
For the eligibility meeting, that comes before, obviously, the initial IEP meeting. I'm trying to think back. We just went through this with my son back in the summer.
Yeah.
We were part of the summer crew with that and getting him to take over. He's on an IEP for his school. And I don't remember the eligibility meeting, if I can get the word out. Is this the standard process? Has been in place for a while? Okay. Maybe that was something that my wife went to and I did not. I'm not sure.
That's typically the meeting where the assessment specialist, the school psych, the speech language pathologist, the occupational therapist, they're reviewing all of the assessment findings. And the team is making a decision about whether that student is eligible for special education or not.
Oh, so that's not necessarily where the parent would be at?
They are there. Yep.
Oh, they
Parent,
are there.
Parent has to be a part, or is invited, is there at all of
Gotcha.
this. Yeah.
So, and then how does that break down then from the initial IEP meeting?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you care? I'm going to run to the next slide and I'll walk through that whole timeline.
Okay, okay.
Is that good?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I have some questions on that.
No, those are great questions. So we're
Before,
gonna,
sorry, before you go to the next slide, on the 14-day window, so
Yes,
if a
ma'am.
parent leaves and they say, hey, I want to take some time to look over this, then like walk me through the process after that. Do they have to come back to the school and schedule another meeting? Do they, like, what does that window work and how's that work?
So typically what happens at the eligibility or the IEP meeting, right, is we present the proposal that's been crafted between the school, the parent, everybody at that meeting. After that meeting happens, the parent is going to get a written summary. It's something, and I have it on another slide, but it's called a prior written notice. And that prior written notice is going to detail what the team is proposing and or refusing for the student. From the time that the parent, gets that prior written notice, that's when your 14 days begin. So typically, what happens is they get the documents that they need to sign at the meeting they attend, or the teacher will email them or send them. We have an electronic signing system called PandaDoc. They'll send them that way. And then the parent has that 14 days to decide how they want to, whether they want to agree or disagree, or whether they want to ask for another meeting. So it depends. Can we have another meeting if a parent asks for it? Absolutely. Do all parents ask for another meeting? No, not necessarily. Sometimes they go through, they review it, they read it, they're good with it. Based on our explanation, they sign, send it back in. Once they do that, we can implement and move forward. Does that help?
If they needed to make changes, it has to be another meeting, or they could just like put the changes in the document, or?
Yeah, changes would require another meeting because decisions in an IEP are team-based, not individual-based, unless it's like a typo or a name misspelling or something like that. But if it's content changes, those are team decisions. So even a teacher can't do that individually, right?
Yeah, I have a quick question. At which one of those steps is that procedural safeguard packet given to parents?
So they will get it multiple times. They will get it when written consent is given at the very first step.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they will probably get it again at the eligibility meeting and again at the IEP meeting.
Okay, perfect. Good.
That's a great question too. All right, anything else on this one? We're gonna dive a little deeper. All right. So special education process. This is the very first thing, right? That initial consent. I mentioned that a minute ago. This is where we get parental permission to evaluate due to that suspected disability. This is initiated either when the parent requests, and sometimes we do have parents that request, or anybody on the school team suspects a disability. Again, that's typically done in that general referral meeting where we're coming together problem solving. It doesn't have to be initiated in that way. That's just the most common way.
So the evaluation process, is it always done from our staff, or do we sometimes have a provider outside that assesses?
No, our staff does the evaluations, right? We have staff that complete all of our evaluations. Mhm.
So like vision and,
Yes, ma'am.
okay.
Yes, ma'am. Mhm. So now we've gotten initial consent, right, on the previous slide. Once the parent gives consent for that evaluation, the team then has 60 calendar days in order to complete that evaluation, which sounds like a really long time, right? 2 whole months. Well, when you take out weekends and you take out any day that the school is closed or the child is sick or the teacher is sick, those days start to dwindle. Really, you're looking at if school is not closed at all and nobody is ill, then you got about 40 days to complete 40 working days when a child would be at school to complete the evaluation.
If I'm not mistaken, that includes summer, right?
It does. Yep, so that's my third bullet under that first section there. It doesn't stop for weekends, holidays, summer, days schools are closed, days people are sick. That timeline keeps rolling. The other thing that I want to note, that second bullet there, after we do that initial evaluation, we're going to give you that prior written notice. If you remember I said earlier, that is that summary document that's provided to the parent. Once we propose something, it's provided to that parent within 10 school days. And it's going to detail what was proposed and or refused. So, any questions on that section?
Yes. So I think some of the emails that we've received, we're talking about zeroing in on this, the evaluation and then the eligibility meeting. And so parents who request to get that evaluation in advance of the eligibility meeting may do so. Is that correct?
If it is completed in advance, yes. Our practice is if it's completed and they request it, we provide it to them in advance, yes.
And does the state law have a requirement for when it must be completed by?
No, it does
A
not.
deadline?
No. No, the state law doesn't have that. Honestly, I think when I think of evaluations of this nature, I think that I liken it oftentimes to getting a report from your doctor and getting that report without any explanation. I don't know about y'all, but I am in no way qualified to interpret any kind of medical test or something to that nature. And so when my doctor reviews those with me, he's usually with me, he or she, and explaining those things to me. We treat this in a very similar way. And the parent, we are reviewing it. The people who are qualified to administer the assessments and interpret those results are the ones that are reviewing that with the parent and explaining it to them. Then
But the law, just to be clear, but the law does not have that in place.
it does not, no.
Because they have
IDEA
the right to receive it prior.
No, there is no part of Tennessee law or federal law that requires an evaluation report in advance.
But if we have it available, if it's finished,
Our practice.
our practice is to give it to them.
Is it common practice that they wouldn't be done in advance of the meeting?
I think it varies. Again, it's individualized. There may be a psychological report that somebody's working on the day before the meeting to finish up. Sometimes the timeline of appointments for conversations, the testing, renders it that way. Maria, I don't know statistically speaking how many are that way, but
I don't think we have a data number
Yeah.
a way to track that, but I can tell you that just anecdotally, we don't get a ton of requests in advance. Most of the parents come to the meeting, they get a review of their results, they ask questions, they go home, they process it if they have questions, and then we meet again if they need it, or we talk on the phone to answer their questions. That's what typically happens.
Do you think that's maybe because they don't know that they can request it in advance?
I don't know. I really haven't ever experienced that.
How is the IEP then put together for this? Let's say the evaluations and things aren't done till the day before the meeting.
well,
And
this slide describes how.
Yeah,
Because there's
yeah, we're gonna
still,
keep
there's
walking.
still other
okay.
timelines after that.
This is, yes.
The IEP's not put together immediately.
So we've got eligibility up here. Now we're going to move to initial IEP. So then after we have the eligibility meeting, then there's 30 calendar days between the eligibility and the first IEP meeting. It may be sooner, right? But we have to have it done within 30 calendar days. So Tony, to your question, that's when we're putting it together, right? We're taking all the data that we've gleaned from the evaluations. We've got parent input, we've got observations, we've got the teacher's input, and that's how we're making a draft of the IEP. And there is, and it's on the third bullet under initial IEP, there is a Tennessee law, it's not in federal law, that requires that the IEP go home to the parent, so that draft of the plan, 48 hours in advance of the IEP meeting. And so, I guess that maybe was put in place maybe 7, 8 years ago, approximately. Don't quote me on the number of years ago. It's a state board reg, sorry. And so that's 48 hours in advance of the IEP meeting.
So the eligibility meeting needs to happen within 60 days of the approval for testing.
The consent.
And so it could be on day 58, 59, 57, depending on scheduling, whatever. Then the parents have 10 days after that to say, okay, I want to go through the IEP process.
14.
14, I'm sorry, 14. And then that initiates that 30 days.
Correct.
Okay.
So, yeah, I have that's probably more of a statement. So if I understand this, the evaluation is done by the psychologists and the support staff, depending upon how many services the child needs. And then at that initial evaluation, the professionals come and explain to the parents all this, what they found out, what the child needs, and just like, a doctor would and stuff.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and so then, after that, then they have that 14 days to evaluate, or to process all of that stuff. And then you're going to proceed with the IEP, which is more the procedures for how to help the student.
You're going to serve the child.
Yeah, how the child's gonna be served, right? Okay. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So then, after we've had our 30 calendar days, or maybe we're at 20, we've done it a little sooner. We've given the invitation to the meeting, which is 10 calendar days in advance for the parent. They've gotten the IEP draft 48 hours in advance. We meet. We develop the IEP, right? We're looking at goals, we're looking at services, accommodations, maybe modifications to support the student. And then, after that, they're going to get that document again that's called a prior written notice, that is that summary document that explains to the parent what we're proposing and what we're refusing. So, for example, it might have, we're proposing that Maria have services in math and reading and occupational therapy, right? And it's going to tell why. And then it's going to give anything else we considered and we didn't agree on, right? So maybe the team considered physical therapy and decided, Maria really didn't need that service based on the data. So the parent gets that prior written notice within 10 school days of the initial IEP meeting. And then after that, the parent has to give us consent before we can implement that initial IEP. So we're waiting at that point for the parent to decide if they want to proceed with the proposed IEP or whether they don't. If they want another meeting, they could certainly ask for that. But that very first IEP, the parent has to give that consent for us to implement. Any questions on that part?
I have a question about, when parents maybe don't agree with an evaluation, and I'm just asking questions. Do they have an opportunity to get a second opinion outside of the school system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me say this first. We want to do everything we can to help that parent feel comfortable and understand the results. So that's our first go-to, right? If that requires another meeting for us to sit down, review it, does the parent think some additional assessment is needed? Do we need to talk through that? So that's kind of our first go-to. But parents do have one of the rights under the procedural safeguards is what's called an independent education evaluation. And there are certain instances in which a parent or a child rather is eligible for that. And so if the parent doesn't agree with our results, they can ask for that independent education evaluation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So if the parent asks for an independent education evaluation, again, we have these acronyms, we call it an IEE. And so when that is, if they're approved for that, right, they meet the criteria for that, once we receive that report, we schedule another either eligibility or IEP, depending on why they asked for the IEE, and we will consider those results as a team. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Okay. All right, so now we're moving on to the annual IEP, right? We've gone through consent, we've gone through eligibility, we've gone through the initial IEP. Now annually.
Before you say annually, just, your question triggered something in my mind. Parents can say, I don't want special education services. That's their choice. They have the power to turn that down.
Even if a student qualifies, they do not have to accept services for eligibility.
So are the evaluations and these reports and things, are these, because I know IDEA has it written in there that they can get those documents, like student records, right? 48 hours in advance of a meeting. Are these not considered records?
So I don't think that they are official student records until they are presented, signed, and it becomes the official report. I think before it is reviewed, signed, agreed upon, all of those pieces, it is a draft. And so that isn't a part of their official record while it's in the preparation phases.
Correct, it's not part of their official record, but the Tennessee Open Public Records Act allows them to request those records even if they are a draft. So,
True.
Dana, do you have anything to add to that?
We can discuss that offline. I don't want to,
We don't have to discuss it offline. We can discuss it right now. That's what Maria's here for.
I don't know that Maria can offer that legal advice on the Tennessee Open Records Act.
If I may, Dana, your microphone's not on.
I just said I don't think Maria can offer that legal advice as to the Tennessee Records Act. So there is a Tennessee Public Records Act. Someone could make a request if it is in fact their child. Then my office would look and see whether or not it is an open record, and if it is, provide that. There is not the 48-hour guideline. What there is what is reasonable time period. There is also 7 days after a request. If it's not reasonable to provide that request to the requester, then my office provides an estimate about when that request would be available.
Okay.
If the,
Assuming that's all the case, I have no argument with any of that. I don't know how we honor parents and their children by going into a meeting if these things aren't completed until the day before. We drop this on them in a meeting where we're gonna tell them all these different things about their child. I just went through this with my own son. Those meetings can be somewhat devastating for a family. It's hard to hear a lot of times. You have people that break down. It would seem to me that it is nowhere even close to a best practice to conduct it that way. And I get timing and all of that, but I think if we're truly, and I think we all are here, we would agree that it's the student and their families that are the priority here, this should be a common practice for them. It's just a simple way to honor them. They have the dignity to be able to digest this, process it, get a cry out at least a day or two before they have to walk in and sit in front of 5 people that tell them all this news. And we can get all legal and mealy-mouthed about it, but I think that's just a way to provide for ourselves a way to obfuscate that. And I don't think that should be our default. I think we should look for ways to make that policy, in my opinion.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit of my experience, and it may not happen every time. When families talk to our schools about the testing, that's when that discussion first happens. You know, there's a suspicion or there's a possibility that your child might have some disabilities we're going to test. They go through the process of the testing, and they have those conversations, and in essence say, you've got time, and there's procedures with those rules for the dates, but there ought to be that conversation too. This can be hard, to your point. You've got time to process this. You don't have to make a decision today. In those times when the work has been done, we do provide it like we talked about. And I see what you're saying. And I think this gets back to what we were talking about earlier. This is so individualized because every person's response or reaction to that information is going to be different. And you're right, we need to be empathetic to that. And what I see, and our hope is it's a human effort, it may not always be perfect, but what I see is I see in the ones I've sat in, the conversation with the parents letting them know, hey, you need time to process this. And I see what you're saying. I think what you're saying is when the opportunity is there, let them get it ahead of time so they can process it outside the presence of these education folks.
I think something that we should consider, 2 things come to my mind. One is that when we are doing an evaluation for special education, when we are first talking with the parent about consent, we're talking about what disabilities we're suspecting at that time, right? We're not gonna sit down at the table 60 days later and say, oop, your child has autism, or oop, your child, right? We're talking about those things in advance when we are getting consent for the evaluation. Also, the parent is a part of the evaluation, which I think is super important, right? They're providing input, whether that be developmental history, they're providing rating scales, they're providing feedback. They are a piece of all of the evaluation all of the evaluations for eligibility.
And Marie, could you also talk briefly about the difference between a doctor's diagnosis and what our education folks are doing?
Yeah, that's a good point. There are times when a student might have a medical diagnosis of a disability, something like autism or like dyslexia, and that student still has to meet eligibility criteria for an educational disability, which is different than a medical diagnosis. And they don't always align. A student could have a medical diagnosis of autism and not meet the educational criteria. The flip side is true. A student may have an educational disability of autism and have never gotten a medical diagnosis. So they are different, right? Medical diagnoses and educational eligibility.
But Tony, to your point about if it's something that's showing up first on the educational side, that can be devastating.
I mean, it is. You know, we went the route of, we had an evaluation through Siskin, and which was we were on the wait list for a year for Siskin and Vanderbilt for an autism evaluation. I think we got Siskin first within 10 months. And so we went through that process, and then we took that, and then we had, you know, the school evaluations and all of that. But it was, I just have to say, it was less of a hard conversation in the medical diagnosis than it was in the IEP meeting. Reason being is just, it could have been that we had a wonderful doctor, you know, who was just very kind. He was a very great guy. I'd highly recommend him. But also, just from my experience back in August, whenever, July, August, you know, you sit down and you've got this very clinical language detailing out these different things that are wrong with your kid and things that you didn't really even consider, but they're not, well, you know, we also did this evaluation and we kind of found this, and you have this rating scale and it falls in this and it falls in that, and you're this category, and it's all these labels and all these different things, and that is heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
It is heart-wrenching, and we got the report ahead of time, and it was still heart-wrenching. And we had an advocate that, you know, helped walk us through that, and it was still heart-wrenching. So it worries me that people that wouldn't have an advocate or wouldn't get it ahead of time, and if I don't want to say excuse, but if our default is, well, you know, we don't have to provide it ahead of time, and, you know, then you sit and you go through this, that just to me seems like a very cold way to approach something like this. And so I just think we very seriously need to look at making that more solidified, because it is hard. And two, with, you know, I know there's like the 14 days and all of that, but, you know, and even me, we got done with our IEP meeting, and it was like, you know, and here, just sign this here, and we'll get started right now. I had no idea of a 14-day, and I'm a school board member with a kid in there. So it's not clear. So I don't think these waiting periods and all of this that we put in there, oh, when we're building all this time, that may be, but it is not clear to the parent. It's not made clear to them. So I think we have to work at making that a priority.
So let me make a comment if I may. I'm sorry, Claire, do you want to go first, or?
Yeah, just a
Sure,
quick point.
please.
Mr. Golden, just think about, I keep coming back to the meaningful participation piece in my
Yeah.
head.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, if a parent, it gets that report, at least even just 24 hours in advance of the meeting, and they can read through it, they're already able to come in and be a slightly more, you know, prepared and a meaningful participant in that conversation. And it might even then prevent having to have secondary meetings that you know, a principal has to attend and all of these different staff members has to attend. So that's kind of the angle that I'm thinking about all of this from. I've received these reports for, one of my children, and not as a part of this school system, but my husband and I were able to read it, and then we had the meeting with the psychologist, and I was able to ask questions. So I hear what you're saying, Maria, but I don't think that it's as complicated as, sometimes they're made out to be in all situations. So I just want us to think about that meaningful participation piece.
Thank you for that. I think we have room to grow. I will say, it is totally unacceptable if anyone has even implied to you that the answer is, we don't have to provide it. That should not be happening. And I haven't seen it, but if it has happened, it shouldn't happen, and we have room to grow.
Yeah. I mean, just on that point, I have heard reports
Okay,
of
well,
that.
thank you.
I would agree. Oh, go ahead, Eric.
Sure, so it feels like maybe we're talking about two different things here. One is the draft report, which is, I understand, it's a finalized copy. It's, ready to be reviewed with changes made afterwards if and when needed. The other thing we're talking about here is work product, which is incomplete evaluations. Things are started as to what you testified to, which you explained. In some cases, maybe there is even conflicting points of view from educational needs and then medical evaluations or so forth. So I've gone through 2 of these evaluation processes and multiple IEP meetings. I said, when we went through it, there was a lot of material there, a lot of reports and going through, and it was helpful to have that expert in the room to sort of explain, well, what does that mean? What is that test based upon? Everything else with that. And I would just, when we're talking about being compassionate to the parent, I don't know that it's compassionate to give them incomplete work product that may be giving a false impression or conclusion or an incomplete one, and certainly without the ability to have an expert in the room to ask questions about and have those conversations, because as you said, it is a team conversation. Now, the draft one, I think you stated, it's our standard process to, must be provided 48 hours in advance. So that is being provided ahead of time. The question about the work product, incomplete work product, that being provided, I think that's where I'm not agreeing if that is the statement that should be provided.
I think sometimes what I come back to, and being in hundreds, maybe more, of these meetings throughout my career thus far, I think that it is overwhelming, right? It is a lot of information, and it is hard sometimes, right? I can speak both personally and professionally, right, on this topic. And so I think that what I come back to is, I never want a parent to get something, not know how to interpret what they're looking at, and be devastated for a reason that they didn't need to be devastated, right? Because they don't know what they're reading. And I'm not simply implying that our parents aren't smart people. That's not it at all. I'm saying that if you didn't have training in these types of assessments, statistical analysis, standard scores, percentile ranks, I don't know that you would know exactly what is being communicated. And so that is the one thing that I think about. I do acknowledge that we need to be compassionate. We need to make sure that parents understand their rights and have the time to review all of this and provide things in advance when we're able. Right, I do agree with that, but I also think that we also need to be cognizant of the fact that sometimes parents might not know exactly what those scores are telling them and what that means for their child's future. And so hearing a professional that is trained to interpret them, review that, and answer questions, I think is helpful.
And Claire, maybe your suggestion is well, I'm not going to say maybe, your suggestion is something we need to look at, which is in those situations, maybe a phone call ahead of time could be helpful.
Well, that's kind of, I was going to comment on that, the meaningful participation. I think that's, really important. And I'm on the side of having the information ahead of time so they can come into the meetings and ask these questions. And of course, they can email and shoot a quick email saying, what does this mean? But I think, I think it should be best practice to give the parents information ahead of time, and so they can process it, and then they can really, because I've been there, and they can really be more of a part of the meeting and offer solutions and advice to what will work best for their child, because they know the child best.
Maria,
Yeah, I have,
may I, or go ahead, Dan.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
yeah, Maria, I have a question. Now, I've had emails left and right about different things like the draft, for instance. That says it's a draft. On the initial, it's an evaluation. Is this an evaluation draft? Is that the same? What's the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically not. Typically when we come to an initial eligibility meeting where we're sharing results of assessments, typically that document is the final compilation of that multidisciplinary team. So that report is not just the psychologist, for example, information, right? It's input from parents, it's input from teachers, special educators, general educators, all different kinds of people that psych is synthesized, looked at it related to the state's eligibility criteria, and provided that in a report. So that typically is a final product, unless, right, if we're reviewing it and there's a typo or a name change, or the parent says, oh, wait, they learned to walk at 15 months, not 12 months, right? We're gonna go back and make changes like that if there is something that is a clerical error like that. But typically those are final products. The draft comes in for the IEP. That is the plan that has the student's goals and services and accommodations.
Well, for an annual IEP, what would parents ask for? A draft in advance? Is that what they're asking for?
For an annual IEP, they don't have to ask for anything in advance. It's provided to them unless they say they don't want it.
So everyone's provided information about their child beforehand?
For an IEP, yes,
For an IEP.
unless the team is not doing a draft. Now, sometimes that happens, like if a parent calls a meeting and we don't necessarily know what the meeting is, we don't know what they're asking for in advance, we're not gonna make a draft because we wouldn't know what to change, right? So we'll come to the table and we can make changes in real time if we need to. But otherwise, if it's an annual meeting or an addendum that the school is calling and they're creating a draft, it is provided to the parent 48 hours in advance. It's actually on the invitation that the parent gets. They select a box, I do want a copy or I don't. If they don't, then obviously we wouldn't necessarily provide it. But if they check, yes, I want a copy, or let's say they don't check anything at all, we don't get the invitation back, we still send it.
Gotcha.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, sorry, Dan.
No, go ahead, that's all right.
Well, I was just, so, I guess when it comes to the evaluations and things, and we can't give it to them in a fragile state or something that might be conflicting and all of that, that's just where I have a hard time logically trying to process about how, if the information is in that state the day before the meeting, I don't know how it automatically gets there the next day for that meeting to be played. If it's in such a fragile state that the parents can't even read it, and everything is, there might be things that conflict with each other and all of that, then I'm not really sure how we could even go into a meeting, because it seems like we would be going in with fragmented information. So that just kind of seems absurd to me. Secondly, I mean, people can read. I mean, they may not be, educated in this field, but they can read the reports, they're gonna have it, in 2 days. They're gonna be sitting down with professionals in 2 days. I agree with the meaningful participation. You can't have meaningful participation in any meeting where there's an agenda and there's all the information that 5 people have and the one party doesn't, and they're supposed to be a meaningful participant in this 6-member team, and they've gotten nothing while everyone else has had it, and they've not been able to read it or anything. I don't know how in the world we would call that meaningful participation. Just, it's illogical on its face. So, once again, I don't know how we can justify saying, running right into a meeting if the evaluations and the data is in such a fragile state the day before, so much so that we can't give it to people, and then we have the meeting the next day and somehow it all came together, but just in that magical, couple hours. And two, once again, people, they can read. They can read.
Okay.
And to have meaningful participation, I think they need that, because you don't even know what kind of questions to ask in the middle of that. Even with the professionals guiding you through it, you're just trying not to cry half the time. Much less know what to answer. And then at the end, it's hey, go ahead and sign this so we can get this implemented. Maybe there's a 14-day thing mentioned, maybe there's not. So it's just, that's my concern.
I'm still hearing about meetings where they go in and there's a verbal evaluation about your child. And then, of course, to get the answers, you have to come back on Friday when the IEP documents are ready. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well,
Verbal
It
evaluation?
seems to me like the emails that I'm trying to understand, it seems like there's more than one meeting to get to the IEP meeting.
There are multiple meetings. You have to
Okay.
have an eligibility meeting to determine eligibility.
Well, they're all, the initial, they're eligible now. I'm talking about annual, okay, or a third year
Okay.
reevaluation. Is there an evaluation written for that first meeting where they say, okay, your child seems like he's really advancing in this area, but really falling behind in this area? Is there a document that they can sit down and read and then prepare for why does it have to be 2 meetings? I mean, it would save a whole lot of money, a whole lot of time if we had an IEP meeting.
I'm not.
I think that if a document is present and available to every one of them, they could read that outside of a meeting. And then they can go outside and go to get professional advice or, an advocate to explain this stuff. So they're all prepared for the meeting.
To answer Dan's question, Maria, I think with annual meetings, they're often just one meeting annually.
Usually.
Yeah.
Unless the team doesn't finish, right? If they've allotted an hour and, people have other commitments, they may have to re-meet if they didn't get through the annual IEP. But I would say the vast majority of the almost 7,000 kids are one meeting to do their annual
Right.
IEP.
One other thing I just wanted to say is a lot of parents that I've heard from say one school is different from another. One principal will say, well, I didn't know anything about that, the first evaluation. I didn't know that you could get them. Or some schools provide it rather than, have to be asked about it. They provide it. We need I think Tony said it, we just need a standing operating procedure on this, and I'm probably sure we've got one, but that's what I wanted to know, is the people have that document in their hand, they're preparing for the meeting. It seems like the meeting would go much better and get it all done. I mean, geez, how much time does this take? It's very time consuming for staff and teachers and counselors and everyone. Plus the parents, when they've got to have 2 meetings, they've got to take off work. Some areas in this county people work. And it's very difficult. So, I think it's something pretty easy that we could fix if we really put our heads together for the parents and staff and teachers.
I had a couple questions. I want to, how is the information for that child gathered and organized, and is it stored in one place electronically? Or do we have, are we keeping a record of like, okay, they met with a speech therapist or a speech pathologist on this Tuesdays and Thursdays, here's her reports. Are we collecting all of that and keeping it in one spot on each child who has an IEP? And I have one more question after that.
Okay, yeah, so that's a great question. We have it's not a cumulative file, but it's their special education file, and it's both a paper file and electronic file. And so the state actually provides an electronic database called TN Pulse, P-U-L-S-E. And it is required to be used statewide. If you've ever seen an IEP document, it was generated from that system, right? Used to be called Ed Plans, as some of you may be familiar with that terminology. But TN Pulse is that electronic database, and that's where we plug in the information and it generates the documents, and all districts in Tennessee are required to use that.
Has the reports on there, like notes,
And then our
everything?
reports, once we're done with them, we upload them into the system so that they are housed there. We also keep a paper copy as well. And so each student with special education has a paper file in addition to the electronic file. 504 as well.
And
Hold
then,
on 1 second, Donna, just that goes right along with that question.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
are you talking about like a service log? Like that they,
Right, right,
when they
right.
have, so,
Yeah,
yeah, I
service
guess, so
log.
are there service logs kept for, the services that they're
Tennessee
receiving
Pulse.
throughout the year? So that, like, if they're supposed to go out on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you know, to have a speech therapy or occupational therapy or what have you, are logs maintained that says, yep, it was done this day by this person at this time
And here are
with
their
this
notes,
student type of
you know.
thing?
Yeah. So we, for all of the services in the IEP, all services are intended to address goals, right, in the IEP. That's the reason we provide the services, to give them access and to address goals in the IEP. So from there, our staff are required, whether that be a speech therapist, a special ed teacher, a hearing teacher, whatever it happens to be, to collect data on those goals. So the data is logged in, and now staff have the ability to log that in any way they want before they enter it into the progress report that is given quarterly. So some of them keep it on paper until they enter it into the database. Some of them put it right in the database the time they take it. So it's not a service log per se, but it is a collection of their data as they are working with that student and working on those goals and entering them into the database.
What do you mean by data in that sense? Like, I guess I'm like a summary of what they're doing, that's one thing. But if they have specifically determined that this child, per the IEP, is supposed to receive these services this amount of times per week at this time, surely there's a log that's kept. This is done and it's done by this person at this time, like, correct?
So there's not a log that, I mean, right, our teachers have their schedules, our therapists have their schedules, right? They have all the students plugged into their schedules, and they serve them at those times. They're not writing down on a sheet of paper every time a child comes into their classroom or comes into their office, right, to provide services. What they're doing is when they're working with students, they are collecting data on the goals that they are addressing with that student.
Yeah.
And then that data is put into our system, provided to parents more frequently if they ask, but at a minimum of every quarter. And that's how the parents, the team, is looking to say, is that student making progress? If the student is not making progress, then we need to look to say, oh, why are they not making progress, right?
Would, have service logs ever been a practice that was maintained in WCS?
For special ed teachers, not since I've been in the district. For related service personnel, several years back, we used them before we got the electronic database system that the state now provides. We didn't have that prior.
Wouldn't it be helpful, I would think, one, just so parents know that it's happening, one, for the IP, but also as kind of like a cover our rear type thing, because let's say we get sued that, hey, I believe this has happened in the past, that we've gotten sued, hey, my child is not receiving the services that they're entitled to based on this IEP. Wouldn't that log then help us to be like, oh no, they did, and here's the log that they got it, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I mean, that's, service logs, I don't know, that seems like would be a common practice and very practical and helpful.
we go to great lengths for attendance, normal attendance, every 15 minutes or something. Wouldn't the therapist or the teacher providing the service, wouldn't they have a second attendance roster or something that I saw this student at this time? It
So-
would be attendance.
So and Maria, fill in or correct me, when a student is pulled out for a specific service, as an example, occupational therapy or physical therapy, direct hearing services, we do have those records of those students being pulled out for those service. We have a record that they received that service on that day.
So we collect the data that we
Yeah,
are
the data-
collecting when the
data
student
evidence
is
that they
working on the
received
goals.
the service, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
it's not a service log per se, like I
Yeah.
saw Maria for 15 minutes on this day or this day. It's not that. It's, I worked on this goal and here is the data that I collected.
So there are records of that, but it's gonna be related to the
And the date
specific
is
goals.
connected on, as well as the data points when they collect
So,
the data.
so in that, okay, so maybe it's just like the cart or the horse here, semantics, but is there a date and time linked to that data
There's-
each time?
Yeah, there's not a time, like it doesn't give amount of minutes, but it does have a date connected to each data point, yes. And that's printed on the, parents get a graph of that. Now, I will say, the system itself has had some kinks in terms of printing those graphs out of WCS's control, so we've been working really diligently to try to get that in a format that is helpful to families, working with the state to try to say, ooh, these have to be readable for our families. So, but yes, it does have a date connected to those data points.
Is it standard practice that that is collected after each service
Depends on
provided?
how the goal is written. So each goal is written, the team crafts each goal, and so sometimes goals are worked on every time they see the provider. Sometimes data's collected on those goals, once a week. It depends on what the goal is and how many goals in that area a provider is working on within their service time.
Maria, would it be fair to compare them to,
Sorry, I was.
I know, it's non-directional, I'm sorry. Would a comparison to like medical records be a fair comparison?
I think so. I mean, I think when you get medical records and it has a test and the results, I think it's kind of like that.
I will say, I've seen nursing charts at hospitals. It's not gonna be that kind of
No.
detail.
Sure, no, but I'm just sort of thinking the notes that perhaps the doctor's taking with the visit or so forth, is that, I'm just trying to visualize it in my mind. Sometimes they're more formalized,
Yeah.
sometimes less so. I know that's a much more regulated, but, you know.
It's typically however the goal is measured. So sometimes that's an accuracy percentage. Sometimes it's a number of trials and number accurate. Sometimes it's number of attempts. It really kind of depends on what goal, whether that's a reading goal or a social skills goal or a math goal. It kind of depends.
So I have something I noticed on the other thing. You talked about the different reports that are handed out. So all of that information is, like, they have their regular, every quarter, they have that IEP report, which gives the parents that data.
Yes, every quarter at a
So-
minimum.
Right. It's just, and then they get their classroom reports as well.
In
So-
addition, yes, ma'am.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
The quarterly report on the IEP goals is in addition to what every other student gets. So they're still going to get your traditional classroom progress reports and report cards and things like that from their teachers, but the progress report is in addition to that.
Right, so that would give the data that Tony is asking about.
Whether the student is progressing on the goal, how, are they on the way to reaching their goal or are they not?
Okay,
I
thanks.
guess.
Maria,
I
I'm
just-
going to jump in with a question, Tony.
Yeah,
hang
yeah,
on.
yeah.
I still got my second question too.
The, going back to the slide that you've shown us, both the top and the bottom section, it says, if a draft, in the third bullet of each, if a draft is being developed. Is there a scenario in which, for an IEP meeting like this, there wouldn't be a draft being developed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes there's not. So for example, if the team is coming together and they're coming together to discuss one specific purpose, right? Let's say the students, oh goodness, maybe needs counseling, right? And we're gonna come together and talk about that. The team may not develop a draft because nothing's changed yet for them to put forward to present. They're gonna come to the table with the current IEP, they're gonna talk about it, make changes in real time, and then provide it to the parent. Another scenario where that might be the case is if a parent calls a meeting and we don't necessarily know what they're asking for, we really wouldn't know what to change in a draft. So we would come with the current IEP and make changes in real time.
So in every instance in which there is a draft being developed that's going to require discussion or a decision, that draft is being given to the parents 48 hours in advance.
That is our expectation and that is the requirement, yes,
And that's a state requirement.
it is.
Okay. So I think we've got to, we're diving pretty far into the weeds here, which is fine, because I wanted us to be able to have this discussion, but I think there's still some unclear issues as to what the real concerns actually are as far as what's not being provided versus what is. I mean, because I think it's going to require some further discussion as to whether there's procedural changes needed or policy changes needed or any of that, because I think we're kind of spinning our wheels here a little bit, because I don't know. We're hearing you say that if a draft is developed for a discussion, the parents are getting it 48 hours in advance.
They are for the IEP, yes, sir.
But that not every meeting requires a draft
Correct.
to be decided upon.
And Mr.
Correct.
Chair, to that point, the heart of what I've heard, I've concentrated on the eligibility process as opposed to the IEP process, because it's the testing, some of the psychological tests, for example, that are after that initial, that are prior to the evaluation meeting, which does not have that guarantee that it's going to be provided within 48 hours, whereas the IEPs do if there's a draft.
So the other question I have, and this goes back to a question that was where Dana engaged a minute ago, and so this question is either for you, Jason, or Dana. Under what scenario would information about a student not be available to the parent of that student upon request?
I think that's a question for Dana with respect to the records.
So, several different laws that deal with records. Generally, with a student, we're looking at educational records. We've got a procedure. There's federal law as well as some state law dealing with educational records. Those typically, and let me preface it by saying, I'll tell you what the law is, then I'll tell you what our practice is. If it is an educational record, then under federal law, we are allowed 45 days to provide that to a parent. Very, very rarely does it take us 45 days to do that. But there is that time frame. Obviously, if we have a parent who's looking for a record, we can access it quickly. We're going to turn it over. We want, the other piece is the law requires or states that it can be viewed by the parent. Very rarely are we asking the parent to view educational records. It's our practice oftentimes to give them a copy. So we try to be over and above when our parents ask for something and do more.
Can you give me, please finish, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Can you give me an example of something, of a student record that would potentially require, even though we don't do it typically, but that might require up to 45 days to find and provide?
I'll tell you, I can't think of one. Maybe you've seen one.
The closest I can come up with, and I still don't think it would take us 45 days, would be if it is not electronic and it is a CUME file from Franklin High School when it was first built. They're still there. We still get requests for records that old. I've never, since I've been in this role, it's never taken us 45 days. It might take us, though, 2 or 3. Because we can't access it quickly.
So to that point, Mr. Chair, for current students, this happens all the time. A parent calls up to school and says, hey, can I get a record? Within a day or two, they have the record. We don't live by the 45-day rule. To that point, we don't say, well, we've got 45 days to provide you that. And those requests aren't processed through the Open Records Act. They just go straight to the school and they just provide them. And it's simple and it happens daily.
Now, the other piece I do want y'all to hear is sometimes we have to redact records. I'll give you an example for maybe discipline investigation. There could be their child's information and then personally identifiable information about another child. If that's the case, it might take us a little bit longer, still nowhere near 45 days, but that may take a couple extra days to make sure we've redacted that information.
But
So-
there's no, to be clear, there's no piece of information about a student that a parent of that student is not entitled to within some period of time.
If I could interrupt, what about an ugly divorce and the custodial parent or a judicial order?
That may be an example of
That
an
is
exception.
example.
So, again, my office handles those. We get subpoenas almost on a daily, almost daily. In the scenarios that you just talked about, if it's a judicial subpoena, we have 7 days to produce it. If it is another subpoena, I would love to have more time, but we have a pretty quick turnaround. Got emailed today requesting one for 2 days from now.
And there's an occasional situation where a court has ordered that one particular parent doesn't have access to records, right? So that does occasionally happen. But for a parent, primary custodian, to your point, Mr. Chair, now the question I'd like to follow up on related to that, to kind of cycle back to what I think is the heart of these evaluations is, when something is a work in progress, how do we respond to those requests?
So if we are in the middle, I'm going to just use an example of discipline, because that's oftentimes parents want to see not just the notice of suspension, but they want to see the investigation. They want to see the witness statements. They want to see the notes of administrators. Sometimes those notes you can't read them. I can't get that word out. Therefore, they're in their own shorthand, or the writing is just so atrocious. So they may type them out. Again, we're going to communicate with the parent to say, here's part of the records, but we're waiting on XYZ. We've got to redact it, or there's confidential information. I mean, every one of those facts are a little bit different, but we are still trying to get the information to the parent as quickly as we can, because there's a reason that they're asking for it. So, but if it is a draft, then I'm going to, or probably have a conversation with either the teacher or the administrator to figure out why it's in draft form and what the requester is wanting. And then make a decision based upon what we need to do to provide or not provide that document, but provide an explanation.
It may be an issue of language and terminology, but I think the problem is we're saying that by definition, it's a draft until it's final. So whatever it is that's being produced prior to the meeting, regardless of when the parent receives it, is a draft. By definition, it's a draft. So I think that's part of the challenge
Is the
at different stages of a draft, is it eligible to be viewed or not, versus, I think that's the issue of a draft is a draft until it's not a draft.
Right.
But
Well, I guess my
so-
question is the initial evaluation a draft? Because could you go back a slide, please, Maria? Because I think that's the heart of what we're talking about. It's this eligibility meeting where there is a report, and I don't think that report is a draft. And some parents would like to receive that report in advance of the meeting. And that goes to the meaningful participation piece, and And then to see on the next slide that parents receive drafts of the IEP document 48 hours in advance, it does beg the question, why couldn't we provide that same time frame for the eligibility meeting? So it's just something to think about. I think it would require a procedure change or a policy change, but I think there's several board members who have expressed an interest in honoring those requests.
Yeah, and where we're at right now is, and Maria, I may be oversimplifying this, but let me step back. We're gonna have that deep discussion based on this discussion that you all have had, because we do wanna grow and be as empathetic and decent to our families as possible. If I'm not mistaken, Maria, your expectation for your staff is, if somebody asks for it, give it to them. But we have not been proactively giving those prior to the eligibility meeting. Is that accurate?
If it is done, yes, our expectation is that they give it to them,
Okay,
right?
even
So I-
regardless of whether they've asked for it?
No.
Okay.
I should have, no, let me say this. If the team is still working on the report, it is not complete,
Right.
right? It doesn't have conclusions, it doesn't have all the information in there. It wouldn't be, it would almost be like a radiologist giving you something that only had one part of the x-ray, right? Like you want the whole picture of all of the assessments that's been done. So our practice is not to give pieces and parts, because in order to determine eligibility, you need all of the information to look at together.
Right.
So
So
once that is completed, if a parent asks, we're fine
Yeah.
to give it.
Yeah, and Tony, I know you made the point, if it's not completed 2 days in advance, why not, right? I'm using my language.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's kind of my point with it, is I'm like, I don't see why we wouldn't just say, hey, look, we need to put this off 2 more days, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Have this done, give it to the parents, and then have a meeting. I don't see any legitimate reason to say, hey, sorry, we can't get it till right before. And that seems like, I don't know, a poor practice in sense.
So I guess, I mean, if we could, Mr. Chair, if we could, I mean, I think we've all raised our concerns. I'd like to hear the rest of Maria's report, because I want to know what we're doing. And if we have clarifications, if we can clarify what we are doing right now, and then we can succinctly voice our concerns about what we're doing, and maybe, and to tee up our future discussions about but we're not changing anything right now. Like, we just have to identify the issues, but don't belabor them. Let's. Well, we've had, I think, I mean, does anybody question I just think it's time. We've been talking about it for an hour. Like, I understand your concerns. I think they're concerns that we can address at future meetings.
I don't need you to tell me I can't ask questions of Ms. Griego when she's here.
I don't.
That's what I'm here to do.
I'm fine with asking questions. I was like, what we're doing.
I know it might feel belabored to you, but these are concerns that I have.
I understand that.
Sorry.
But you're airing your concerns and not your questions for Ms. Griego. Like, we all understand what I guess the point of her presentation is to tell her the current state of affairs. And I think you've adequately addressed your question.
I'll decide when I've adequately addressed it. You don't get to determine that for me.
Okay,
I'm
gonna jump.
Mr. Chair, please.
I'm gonna jump in, right here, because this is becoming a conversation between two people, not a discussion of the board. Okay? Let's get back to the discussion that we were here to have, which is a presentation about special ed. Now, I can appreciate the fact that we've brought up some concerns. Those are duly noted. We need to dive into those further. If there are places where we need to make policy changes or procedural changes, it's on record now for those things to be pursued, okay? So we will. Those are not going away. You've got notes on that. We need to have further discussions, but I agree that we should, out of courtesy to Maria, let her finish her presentation, because we are an hour and a half into our meeting. Again, we said at the outset this was going to be a lengthy discussion, and it's fine that it was. There's a lot here. There's a lot to talk about in special ed, not just one thing that seems to be a potential sticking point, but there's many other things that are being done in special ed that we need to to process. So let's please do that, and then but all agree that we're not gonna walk away from these issues, okay? Thank you.
And
Please-
Mr. Chair, I'm making that commitment as well. We're not walking away from that.
All right. So I think we talked about annual IEP, and I mentioned that that is done at least annually. Your same 10 calendar days notice of a meeting, your 48 hours in advance of the draft, your prior written notice, all of those things are the same each time we have an IEP meeting. When it becomes the annual IEP meeting and not the initial, the parent has 14 calendar days from receipt of that prior written notice to determine whether they agree or disagree before the IEP can be implemented. So the only difference between the top section annual IEP and addendum IEP is that the annual IEP is required once a year. An addendum IEP means it can be done anytime a team member asks. That's a parent, that's a teacher, that's a principal. Anybody can say, hey, I think we need to come together and discuss blank regarding Maria. If the parent requests the meeting, we must offer that meeting within 10 school days of the request. They still have to receive that invitation. If we develop a draft, a copy is still provided 48 hours in advance, prior written notice. Again, they have that 14 calendar days from receipt of the prior written notice to make their decisions. All right, reevaluation. So we talked about initial IEP and then annual IEP and addendum IEP.
I had a quick question about
Yeah.
the annual and addendum IEPs. How does the team communicate beforehand, and is that communication, whether it's email, because I know they're coming together and the parent's not there, how does the team communicate, you know, what are we going to set for the goals, and do they share assessment, you know, because teachers are constantly assessing, am I effective, am I doing this, or is the child learning, are those assessment notes and the preparation notes, how can we include the parent, or how does the team work together before the meeting, before the parent comes in, and how do they communicate that?
Yeah. So when we develop the draft, there is a section of the draft called the PLAFPS. Oh, that is a terrible acronym. It's present levels of academic and functional performance, I think. Don't quote me on the exact. It's essentially a present level. So when the teacher assesses and they pull all that information together, the general education teacher gives information, the special educator, any assessments that the team has done, that goes in a section of the IEP. So the parent's going to have access to all of that in the draft, in addition to a discussion of it in the meeting. And then
And that's
when
given beforehand to the parents?
yeah, 48 hours. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's a great question. So reevaluation. So this happens for students with disabilities with IEPs every 3 years. So every 3 years, the IEP team is required to come together, review all of the testing that has been done and current eligibility, past eligibilities, current performance, and determine whether the child continues to be a child with a disability or not. Sometimes that requires additional assessment. Sometimes the team says, no, based on all the data we have, we believe this child continues to be eligible, and they sign forms and explain it all to the parents, and then the child continues to be eligible. Sometimes it requires additional assessments. The law does say in the second to last bullet there under reevaluation that if the IEP team determine additional assessments are needed, it says we have a quote-unquote reasonable amount of time to complete those assessments. I can tell you that really has been defined in the case law as 60 calendar days, which is the same as the initial. So we get around 60 days. It might be day 61, it might be day 62, but it's around that 60 calendar days that we're really trying to shoot for with that reasonable amount of time. The other thing, timeline thing, we've mentioned it a couple times, but I have it down there, is that progress reports are provided 4 times a year. Just for your information, it's typically when report cards go home, they also get progress reports. It could be within a couple weeks before or after, but it's around about that time frame.
That's different. Is that different for the EC program, though, correct? A little bit, or no? Is it 4 times a year, too?
It is.
Okay,
the EC program might be providing like curriculum updates more frequently,
Gotcha.
but IEP progress report at a minimum of 4 times a year.
Gotcha, cool.
Great question. All right, so we've swam all through special education and lots of timelines. We're going to jump on over to 504. Section 504 is a federal civil rights law, and it actually, the intent is to prevent against discrimination, prevents discrimination against individuals with disabilities. The idea is that students with disabilities have equal access to education. And so you see that acronym again, that FAPE acronym. It is to ensure that students with disabilities receive a FAPE in public elementary and secondary schools. All right, so key points. Eligibility looks very different for 504. We still do assessments, but the eligibility criteria is much different. There's a little bit more to it, but this is the basic premise of eligibility for 504. Whereas special education has those 18 different areas, this really is looking at some sort of disabling condition, physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities: walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, working, right? So many, many things could make a person eligible for a Section 504 plan. Think of things, sometimes diabetes, sometimes asthma, sometimes dyslexia. Just really kind of depends on the student and their individual needs. A Section 504 plan typically includes accommodations to that learning environment to help the student access their gen ed curriculum. So typically you're thinking of things like additional time, a use of assistive technology, maybe breaks if they need them. Maybe a student is diabetic and they need to have snacks, right? Or take extra restroom breaks, things like that. Those can all be delineated as accommodations if a child were to need that. One of the things that people ask me, well, what's the difference between an IEP and a 504? Really generally speaking, right? It's deeper than this, but really generally speaking, if a child needs specialized instruction in order to receive a free appropriate public education, that's more on the IEP realm. If they need accommodations for access, that's typically the 504 realm. That's not set in stone. There is some variation there, but that's the typical.
This rule has been in place since 1973. It's the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Historically, some of these services have been provided outside of 504, but in the more recent years, we have seen a lot more parents access those services that might have just been informally provided through the formal 504 process. Is that a good?
That is.
Yeah. So our numbers have gone up really just because of trends we've seen across the country, not just here.
It is certainly across the state.
Yep.
Is it fair to say 504 is more subjective and IEP is more objective? Or IDEA is more objective?
I think IDEA has more strict requirements for eligibility, where 504 is more open, more broad.
Okay.
Is that fair? But okay.
Is there a difference in the cost to the school district between accommodating a student and having an IEP?
I think it varies.
Depends on the need of the
Yeah.
student.
It may be that an accommodation includes purchasing a piece of equipment. So it has a potential to have those costs. But we occasionally see that with IEPs as well.
Yeah. For example, a student like me, right? I can't hide. I have a physical disability, right? In school, I needed desks that I could get up and down from, right? And so for a 504, those provided those desks to me so that I could access my education just like my peers. Any other questions? I just real brief on 504, right?
Can I toss this out related to 504s? Do the timelines that we spent time talking about in the context of IEPs also apply to 504s?
Thank you for prompting me. I have that on my notes that are laying over there. So they are similar, right? There are less restrictions, less specificity in 504 with regards to the timelines, but what we've seen in a lot of the case law and things is that they tend to defer to IDEA timelines. So we tend to stick to those. Our goal is to meet annually on 504s. Our goal is to do the reevals every 3 years. We really try to mirror those timelines. There isn't the 48-hour draft piece with the 504, but some of them are very similar. Yep. All right, so the data that I told you would be here. I think, Jay, you had asked about some of this. This is just total disability served, and I have the data all the way back to 2009. well before I was the director here, but just longitudinally, so you can see kind of how we've grown in our serving our students with disabilities. So we have
Is that-
close to 7,000.
I'm sorry. Is that growth proportional to our student growth, or is it disproportionate?
It's not been really proportionate, generally speaking. As an example, our student enrollment data the last 3 years has been pretty flat, and yet we're still seeing some increases.
So it, by definition, then, it's students who are already in the system who didn't have an IEP or a 504 and didn't have one for some reason.
Sometimes
Some.
it's students qualifying,
Some.
sometimes it's students moving in that have those eligibilities from other places. It's both.
And I'm going to toss something out, and this is a hint of speculation. With some of those bar graphs where you see it flattening out and then you see that significant increase, we were growing in those years where you see those bar graphs go slightly down. One variable that I saw professionally, without excellent data nationwide, is when we implemented RTI, which is response to intervention. The basic premise of that is we will give interventions to students in a general education setting, not a special education setting, to help them stay on their grade level standards. So when you hear about Tier 3, Tier 2 RTI, what we have seen, and I think you have a graph for this in just a slide or two, we have seen a reduction in specific learning disabilities, and I believe it's largely because of the implementation of RTI.
We're intervening in general education first.
And so for what that's worth, that's a portion of it. And that was the intent of RTI, to intervene in a gen ed setting and avoid an IEP if the student didn't really need it.
What year did that start?
We may have to look that up. I can't remember.
17, 18, around in there, Dave?
Somewhere around in there.
Okay.
Prior to that? Dave says prior to that.
11 or 12. So I think the implementation of it across the country might have taken a little while, right?
Okay.
And one quick comment is, I know of parents who've moved into the district just for special ed. So
My
Yes.
office gets those calls
Yeah.
regularly.
Yeah, we've had those conversations with families.
Yes.
It's as difficult as it is to talk about those hard times. We do a good job, but I want to emphasize we've got room to grow. This is a human effort, and we've got room to grow. But our folks do a really good job serving our students.
All right. So this is a large graph in terms of lengthwise and a lot of different disabilities here, but it kind of gives you a layout of the disabilities. Again, this includes students 3 to 22. I think, Jay, may have been what you were kind of looking for.
So my question there was really the difference on your previous slide. Were those 6981 including the gifted students? Okay, so what's the 10,500? Is that was in five? Okay, so the difference is 504. All right, that's great.
Yes, I can tell you the exact numbers. So the 6,981 are IEPs. Of those, 2,031 are gifted. Then you look at, we have like 4,950 if you don't include gifted. And then we have 3,571 504s. All right. All right, so this is a slide that I think Jason was referencing, and I want to bring your attention to the light colored graph is specific learning disabilities. So you can see there, Jason mentions we kind of took a dip as RTI really got rolling and being implemented. The dark color graph are disabilities that are more severe in nature. So disabilities that typically require additional supports and services for students, things like autism, emotional disabilities, multiple disabilities, developmental delay, things where students typically need a lot of supports and services. If you can see on that graph, those numbers have climbed pretty rapidly in our district throughout the last several years.
And Tanya, to your point earlier, I'll hear a parent say, my child had blank disability, and I heard this is where I needed to be. Right.
For my daughter.
Yeah.
This I just thought you might find interesting. If you do not include students who are gifted or 504s, 11.9% of our total student population is a student with an IEP. If you include gifted and 504, 25.3% of our total student population has a disability.
So Maria, when you mentioned the $92 million, is that in addition to like the typical children who aren't on one of these programs have a cost associated with? So the 92 is over and above that.
Specific to special ed.
Okay.
Not 504.
So
Right,
if
so-
I may, Rachel pulled that out of our budget, and it was the major categories for special education instruction, 71,200, and then special education support, which is 72,220. So that's an approximation. The reality is our general education teachers serve students with disabilities
That's
as
right.
well. She didn't pull out the numbers in that context.
Right, but it would be roughly, it would be 25% of all the other, if we got a 25% population, then you would, 25% of all the other categories would be allocated to those students, but
Yeah,
it really,
I get your point. Yeah.
their cost is, $8,500 a student more than the general population on average, based on that.
Yeah.
Well, that is sort of a question I was gonna ask is, do we know roughly what it's costing the district per student to serve those, say, the ones that was on 2 slides earlier, that are severe disabilities? I think it was 1,700 some odd that were in the mild to severe category. Yeah, 1,747. Do we know roughly what we're having to spend to serve those students on average?
Maria, if I'm not mistaken, you do have an approximation without factoring in some percentage of our general education cost.
The 92 million really is divided amongst our total student count of students with
Yeah.
disabilities, and that would be how you would get the per pupil for students with disabilities. As far as what you're asking is our students that require more support, I can't think
We
of a
don't have
way
that.
that we could pull that simply because we both might be students that have autism, but I have a lot more services than this student here.
Yeah.
So it would be very difficult to parse that out in that way.
Yeah, disability by disability, we
Looks-
don't really
looks
have that data. Another piece on the revenue side, this is a little more than you asked, the state does have separate funding based on those categories. That's part of the TISA model. And so I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but it varies based on, is it 9 categories? Or
It's-
4, it's 10?
It's funding based on the services, not the disability per se, but how
Right.
many services the student has in the IEP.
Yeah.
Okay, good questions. All right, so 504s, just a growth graph here. Your eyes may be drawn to 16, 17, so I just want to say that prior to the 18, 19, around about in there, 17, 18, 18, 19, we did not have a database to collect all of the 504s. The state had, we actually went out and purchased a program prior to the state providing it for everyone. So I wasn't the director in 16, 17, but I venture to say we did not go from 1288 to 626 back to 1075. So again, that's data that was left for me, but I venture to say that that's a data reporting error. I can feel really confident in everything from the 1920 school year
Maybe
forward.
we should put a big question mark over that year or something. I don't know.
All right. So this is pretty much the last content slide. I just wanted to give you an idea of the number of assessments. I think this is eye-opening that our psychologists, we have around 50 some odd psychologists, and last year alone they completed 1,404 initial evaluations, 2,265 reevaluations, 743 screenings, and 1,674 evaluations for 504. So a lot of evaluations and reevaluations. Our speech language pathologist, 729 initial evals and 536 reevals. Another tidbit I put on here I thought you might find interesting was we do have an assistive technology team who help our students access the curriculum, and they completed 103 evaluations last year. Granted, there are lots of other disciplines, vision, hearing, occupational therapy, physical therapy. I didn't gather all of those for tonight, but they all complete evaluations for students.
And Maria, at the risk of being oversimplified, I want to toss this out. I suspect that a traditional thought when many people hear psychologists is they immediately visualize clinical psychologists. Our school psychologists are the testers. They're doing the testing, they're doing the evaluations, and then of course they're participating in the IEP meetings. The work that they do is not clinical counseling. It is the testing that we've been spending most of our time talking about. I know that's a bit of an oversimplification, but wanted to make you see.
It is different from a clinical psychologist,
Yeah.
although they are trained in some techniques. They do a lot. They are the experts in knowing the eligibility criteria and how to assess for that. And they participate in response to RTI. They give teacher strategies for students. I mean, they're involved in a lot of different things, but one of their primary roles is eligibility.
And they are very much, that position is very much a hard-to-fill position. And I know Vicky's not here tonight. I'm trying to remember. We actually, they are on the teacher scale with an addition to it, if I'm not mistaken.
We moved them to their own scale a couple of years
Thank you,
ago
thank you.
because we struggled to fill those
Yeah,
positions.
so their pay is more than a teacher with that experience because there's a higher demand.
And they do require an advanced degree. You
That's
can't
right.
become licensed in the state unless you have your master's and then your educational specialist degree.
Are we at full capacity with psychologists in every school? Or?
Gosh, I'm gonna knock on wood. Yes, right
At
now
the moment.
we are. Human Resources really helped us by looking at the pay and looking at internship possibilities and things, and that has really worked, and we are fully staffed right now.
And I am actually looking at Angela Frederick at the moment. They are protected by and governed by our MOU with the WCA through PECA.
Maria, with respect to the initial evaluations and the reevaluations, do you have any data on, as far as initial evaluations, how many of those initial evaluations are result in IEPs and 504s and the reevaluations, like what's the renewal rate, if you will?
I can get that for you. I don't have it off
No,
the
that's
top
fine.
of my
That'd
head.
be great.
I will say though that there are times, and she'll get you that data, where especially as the student hits high school, the course offerings and opportunities may change the net result on that for some of those interventions.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for letting me spend time with you tonight. I hope if you gleaned anything from tonight that you know that I really am passionate about what I do. I love kids. I love families. It's part of my life, not just a job to me. So I hope that came through in what I shared with you tonight. And if I can help any of you in any way, please don't hesitate to let me know.
Thank you so much for the
Very much.
preparation and the great presentation.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, I want to add something before you take a break.
I've got a question related to this, actually.
Okay, ask the question.
And it's more probably for you than
Yeah.
for Maria. The conversation earlier was about how the WCS attracts families that have special needs students or disabilities. We all know that's true. Are there things that we do as a district over and above what are required of us by law? Is that more the reason why people come, or is it just that we do such a good job at what we're required to do?
To answer that question, let me tell a story, and I'll try to be brief. When this law passed, when the IDEA passed, our special education director participated in the federal process of setting the regulations and the rules. The moment IDEA passed, we implemented it the way it was intended. And think about, well, I don't know where your life experience is, but there are so many times when a rule comes down, a law comes down, and it takes years for appropriate implementation. The civil rights laws of 1964 are the most classic example to me. It probably, we're still going through some of that, but we initiated it originally. And so from the beginning, predecessors to us set the standard that we're gonna do it right. And we've been adhering to that. There've been errors there, because it's human. There's opportunities to grow, but it's because the people who came before us, for whom we're stewards, set that standard. Maria, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I'm resting my feet. I'm sorry. I wore the wrong shoes. What I will say is that I think we are individualized, which is what the law requires
Yes.
us to do, right? We provide the services that each individual student needs. And so I don't think that is above and beyond. I think that is what we're supposed to do. And I think we are very fortunate to have educators that love kids and are here for the right reasons. And I think that shows to families.
Now, with that, Mr. Chair, sometimes there are disagreements with parents. I've participated in IEP meetings in different roles here at the district before I became superintendent, where sometimes, because of the student's individual needs, the employees of the district, the members of the team might say, we don't think your child needs that service. We believe that's more restrictive than what's best for them. And a parent might say, I want that. I want that special education teacher's assistant in the classroom every minute with my child. And so we do occasionally have disagreements on that. But it ought to be a healthy discussion where parents are informed.
I appreciate that. Well, thanks for the good discussion, and obviously there's more to come on some of these items.
If I may, Mr. Chair, add my last little bit.
Oh, sure, sorry.
Thank you guys for your participation and your good questions and for sharing, especially those very personal experiences that you guys have had. We need that. This is a little bit deeper than scratching the surface of special ed, but I want to give you one example of how much deeper it is. We didn't touch on student discipline at all. And many of the questions we receive from you are related to student discipline in the special education implementation of that. That's a discussion for another day, but there's a lot more to it even than what we've touched on.
Thank you. Unless there's a serious objection to this, I'm gonna let us do the science textbook adoption discussion and then take a break. Is that okay, or do we want the break right now? Okay, let's proceed then with science textbooks.
All right, thank you. Jen Sauer.
One more try. Is it working now? Okay, good. All right, fantastic. I appreciate Mr. Golden letting you guys kind of the reminder that the last time I met with you, I said we're in this like hurry up and wait period, but once it switches over, it's gonna be fast and furious. We are in that fast and furious phase, and we're gonna be there for probably the next month or so. So I'm gonna give you some updates that have happened really in the last 6 weeks or so, and then I'll give you, and here's what's gonna be our next couple of steps. So we start on November 22nd, which was the Friday before Thanksgiving break, just so you kind of have that like time frame in your mind. And this is when the state actually released to all of the districts, here are the publishers that made it through the state vetting process. Just to make it kind of easier for you to look at, I arranged it this way by grade band. If you click on that link at the top, that'll take you straight to the state site so you can see where all those materials were released. One thing I want you to realize is that it's convenient for us to look at it this way. That's not the way the state vetting works. So like a publisher submits materials for each individual grade level, and then the vetting committee vets them by grade. So they say, okay, let's look at kindergarten. Yep, kindergarten passed. Let's look at first grade. Yep, first grade passed. And so what happens is there's this potential for a one-off to happen, like so it's highlighted up there in yellow. There's one publisher that submitted for lots of grades. The only one that passed was 7th grade. due to, remember when we were talking a couple of months ago, that idea of like one of the really important pieces that we get from an adopted curriculum is a continuity of student thought across not just one course, but multiple courses. We made the initial decision that there's not really a place for a resource that's only available in one grade level. So we did present that to the committee. They completely agreed. So that one was kind of an easy one to cross off the list. So we had a committee meeting. We met on December 4th. It was kind of a quick-ish meeting, about an hour and a half after school, where we went over the full adoption process. We presented that list just like you saw. We talked about, is there potential to narrow the list down at all? If so, what procedures does the committee want to use for that? And then we also read and assigned the oath that's part of the TDOE process. So that full oath is here if you want to look at it. That first little part of it is probably the intent of the oath. I declare that I am not now directly or indirectly financially interested in or employed by any textbook publisher or agency. And it continues to say that I'm not going to become financially interested at any point in this process. So here are the work of the committee at that December meeting. The first question that was posed to the committee, what are the grade bands that we want to adopt materials in? And so the decision of the committee was that we're going to divide the content in this way. K to 2 will adopt one resource, 3 to 5 will make a selection, 6 to 8 will make a selection, and then high school courses, because they're so individual in nature, chemistry, biology, physics, each of those will make their own individual selection. I want to talk about that elementary decision for a minute, because that's different from what we do in ELA and math in elementary school. But if you remember a couple of months ago, when we talked about science standards, specifically in K to 2, we talked about how they're compared to even 3 to 5. The focus of the standard, the scope of the standard, the depth and complexity of what we ask is really narrow in K to 2 compared to even the work of 3 to 5. The committee felt that there was the potential that one resource might best meet the needs of K to 2, and a different resource could potentially best meet the needs of 3 to 5. And so those teachers will select in those grade bands. Are there questions about that? Okay. I will also remind you that we are adopting 2 one-off courses, so AP Psychology and Math Reasoning. For Math Reasoning, there's only one book that passed state vetting. When we adopted math 2 years ago, no book passed for that course. Since then, that one book has passed. It is the book that our teachers are already using. So we met with that committee. They said, we don't need to meet to review anything. Bring us back when we vote, and we'll cast the vote. AP Psychology is also adopting a book because of those significant changes to the course made by College Board. They elected to meet on February 14th, which is our district-wide day, to review the books that we have available for that course and then cast their vote later in the month. Okay, as far as paring down the list is concerned, I'm going to give you a little bit of historical information. 2 years ago, we did math adoption. A lot of resources passed, like 7, 8, 9 in some instances in those grade bands. The committee decision then was, that's so many resources, it's going to be really daunting for a teacher and a committee member to fully evaluate 7, 8, 9 books to make a good selection. And so the committee said, let's narrow that list down a little bit. And they decided 4 felt like a good number. That's several different choices, but it's also a manageable task for teachers and committee members to evaluate and make a selection. So we brought that to our science committee and said, given their historical experience, 4 felt like a good number, but let's vote and decide what we want to do for science. K to 5 said 4 publishers passed. Let's put all 4 in front of teachers. High school, remember they're all individual courses, biology had the most that passed, which was 5. Everybody else was less than that. They said, let's just keep those. Middle school had the most, it was 6. And the committee said 6 is starting to feel like a lot to fully dig into a resource, to really think about what's gonna best meet the needs of our students. I think we should pare it down to 4. So here's the process that they used. They had digital access to all of those materials. When the TDOE released the rubric summaries that came from the vetting of the state level, we gave those to the committee, and they had a month to review all those materials. They submitted their selection by electronic form. So it's a real simple form. Question 1, which I didn't write on there, is what's your name? Question 2 was, here are the 6 resources that you are evaluating. Pick your top 4. So I put for you off to the side, here are the results that we got from that selection. The other 2 that aren't up there got lower than the ones that are up there. And so those are the 4 that we put in front of teachers. Questions about that? Yes. Okay, so remember Fast and Furious. We've actually already had another meeting. It was yesterday. We were right here. I don't know if you've noticed around the room, we actually have our materials here from the publishers. This is our site for public review, but it's also where we held our meeting yesterday, which is when we had our textbook publishers in to meet with our committee. So we had the full committee, teachers and parents, here in this room. It was a fun circus day. So we had publishers coming through every about 45 minutes. They switched rooms so that every single teacher had the chance to hear from all the publishers that had materials available for adoption. They had the chance to ask some questions. They had the chance to look at some of those paper materials that are available. And then they also had some time to kind of sit and debrief with each other about what they had learned about all those individual resources. They're gonna take all that information that they learned back to the teachers in their building.
Jen, did every publisher that we're considering show up?
There was one that came on Zoom,
Okay.
but everybody else was here in person. Okay, so what happens next? For teachers, they have those site-based reviews. Remember, there's 5 schools in each grade level around the county. They're actually on the next slide if you want to see, where teachers can go and review print materials. Teachers have also been emailed digital access to every single one of those materials as provided by the publishers. And teachers are going to have job embedded time on that February 14th district-wide day to review materials. And the publishers are invited back that day to be able to meet with teachers before they make their final selection. Again, if you wanted to see, those are the schools where all the materials are available. That, along with all the dates and times, has been sent out to every single teacher so that they'll know where they can go and when they can go to review all of those materials. Okay, what about public reviews? Because that's a big part of the process as well. I don't know if these slides are in the right order or not the right order. I kind of deliberated, but I wanted to tell you, how do we let the public know, and then what are we letting the public know, if that makes sense? So there's lots of opportunities for us to make sure that the public is aware of when and where they can come to review materials. So we've shared information with principals for them to send home in newsletters. We've published the information in Focus. It's been sent through local media and the district's social media channels, and we've published it on district and school websites. Those public review dates and times, again, right here in this building, in this room, we just take the tablecloths off everything and they're available, are listed there. Print materials as well as digital access is provided at all those public review sessions. Also, members of our team are available in this room during those public reviews. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at any of those digital materials that are available. It's overwhelming to try and look through a full curriculum. So if anyone's asking about, like, hey, I know we're adopting science textbooks, what do you suggest? Should I go look at it in person or should I just look at it online? Coming in person, having the physical materials, and having us in the room just to kind of answer questions since they have them, that's really the advantage of coming to those sites. However, we do live in a digital world. Conveniently, TDOE has put together a website where publicly available digital access to publisher materials is posted online. The link is there on the screen. It's a little bit confusing if you go straight to the link, because TDOE is listing not just the materials that pass state vetting, but every single material that was submitted to state vetting. So you kind of have to have two things in front of you at the same time. If you're going through their website, you've got, okay, so here's all the links. I know that that's what was submitted, but then I got to pull up somewhere else. Here's what actually passed. And then their links are really just set up by publisher rather than organized. And so it's hard to know which ones are for which course unless you actually go and open them. So what we did is said, let's make this a little bit more organized and convenient for members of the public to get to. So that little snip there is really just a picture of a little section of the document, but we grouped it by grade band. So it'll say, like, here's K to 5. Here are just the publishers that pass state vetting. Here is how you access the materials digitally. There's a link to the TDOE scoring rubric if you're interested. That document is available on our website, and it's published in InFocus. So if anybody is interested in being able to look at all those materials digitally, our hope is that that organization makes it a little easier to get right to what are the materials that we're actually reviewing for our students.
So, Mr. Chair, I want to emphasize this because you
Yeah.
actually mentioned this to me a couple of weeks ago and said, hey, the state does have some, can we do a link? And I know, Claire, you've asked us the same question. So what we have done is our team has taken all the materials that we've narrowed it down to, eliminated the ones the state rejected, and when we have direct links that will include a link from the article that Carol's team's putting together so that our families can read the InFocus article, click on our list, click on the one they want, and it will take them directly to the materials, directly to the online materials that the state has. And we've not done that in previous years.
No, so it's kind of an evolving process, you know? Math was really the first time that the state had made any of that digital access available. It was a little bit more limited in the math adoption. And so really, like, you know, we learn as we go through things, just like all of us learn as we go through. And we said, hey, now that those digital links are available, there's probably a way to make it a little bit easier for people to access so that it's a little more convenient and, like, clear, here are the materials and here's what aligns with each grade level.
If somebody goes on the state website to find the list of state-approved science text right now, they will find the approved list from the previous adoption. And a bunch of those links are dead. So if you guys hear anything about this, refer them to what Carol's publishing.
Yeah.
And Carol, when are we publishing that?
Well, we've done it.
We already did it once, yeah.
But, if you go on the website under district-wide and textbooks, you'll see it all there. And there's a pop-up. So we'll let you go when it ready.
Carol's team did a great job. Okay, no matter how a public member chooses to review materials, they have access to the forum to submit comments that'll go back to our textbook committee. So if you come here in person, we'll have paper copies of the comment form. That QR code in the corner goes to the digital form. We also have, like, bigger QR codes that they can just scan and get to that. And then if you go to the digital access through the website, there's a link to the electronic form. The electronic form is exactly those same questions. It's just just an electronic form if someone prefers it that way. We collect all of those public comments and that they get shared with our textbook committee prior to any voting that they do. Okay, so then what happens next? Remember, we left off with teachers. They meet together to review materials on February 14th, which is district-wide PD day. On February 15th, we'll send them an electronic form. They have until the 21st, so it's about a week to make their final selection. They're submitting the recommendation to their textbook committee member. The teacher recommendation data is captured. It's aggregated, so it's grouped by school. The textbook adoption committee member gets the teacher recommendation data from the school that they represent. If they're a parent on the committee, they get district-wide data as opposed to school-based data. And then the textbook committee meets on February 25th to make their final vote and recommendation, which then goes to you all. Sure. Do you want me to go back here?
So when the teachers send their votes,
Yes.
is that done anonymously or is it?
So we collect the name of the teacher, but when it's provided to the textbook committee member, it just shows like it's almost like a pie graph of how many teachers at each school select each recommendation. So we do have the information of which teachers cast which vote, but that actual name doesn't get passed on to the committee member. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, and this just kind of to finish up the rest of the process, because then once the vote happens, that's to make sure we can hit all the rest of these deadlines. So our intention is to come back to you at the March meeting to be able to say, here is the final vote of the textbook committee. Once that approval happens, we're able to start passing that information on to the state, get that order into the publishers as soon as we can to make sure that our teachers have materials ready for when students come back in August, because that's when instruction with those materials start. We'll set up dates over the summer to provide training to teachers so that they're ready to use those materials.
So this will be on your March agenda in 2 months for vote.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? All right, thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I know I've gotten a few questions about this, but I think I can confidently say, I hope all of us can. This process has been really transparent and thoughtful, so thank you. Okay, we will take a 10-minute break. Let's come back at, call it 8:40, 8:38, 8:40, and we'll finish out. Thank you. Let's resume our meeting, please. Okay, we will move into our budget update with, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one thing. Operations report first, and then budget update. Mr. King.
The operations report will be part of the budget. So unless anybody has any questions about any projects, I'm going to use my time for the budget tonight.
Ms. Farmer, I'll flag that for the voting meeting on Monday night, there are no budget items. So just for the record, that's fairly unusual, but just so you guys know, that's not an oversight. There are no budget item votes for Tuesday's meeting. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Farmer.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, real briefly, just as a reminder, we're going to bring to you our budget recommendations next month, but Rachel and Brian are going to give you a little bit of a precursor because we're still in that process of preparing it. Rachel?
Thank you. If y'all want to go ahead and get the PowerPoint pulled up for the 25-26 budget update. What will happen is you all are going to receive the copy of the budget next month before the work session. And so we've talked about the pieces, the PCR, the standard staffing standards, enrollment. We talked about revenue last time. I'm going to take up a lot of time next month talking to you about the expenses. So tonight is just a little, don't get in any of the weeds on the numbers. It's just to give you information so when you get that packet, you're going to understand what you're looking at. And then the bulk of the time will be with Mr. King. So if we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. For the 24-25 budget, our current year budget, this is just a reminder, 86% of that budget, of the $548 million, is in personnel. These were the big buckets of personnel, which is salaries and wages, insurance, which that's medical insurance, dental and life, retirement, and then taxes is FICA specifically. So 86% of the budget, which went up, we've traditionally been held right at 85%, and so 86% was a little bit up last year, due largely to the 6% raise. Operations was 14% of that, and these are some of the bigger, just specific lines within operations. We have 22,000 accounts, and so these are just, when you consider of the operations budget, 76 million, half of those are just in these sections. We do pretty well with the operation money that we are given. Go ahead. So you will receive for GP, for cafeteria, and for student-age childcare. There will be sections for each, and the first page behind each section is a summary sheet. And that summary sheet has on it prior year actual, that's that first column of numbers, expenditures, then our current year budget, the current year revised budget, so it'll be 24-25s, and then where it says board, that will be what we are asking the board to review is the potential for the 25-26 budget. The difference between the current year original budget and then that revised budget are all of those amendments and resolutions I bring to you each month as we go through the year, and that's how it gets revised. And so on the left side, under expenses, you're going to see numbers, 71,100, 71,150. All of those are major categories, and these are a summation of each one of those major categories. So part of the budget process starts back from principals up, is department heads meet with their people. We look to determine what the needs are, what we did last year, did it work, did it not work, and then what the requests are, any additional costs. They bring all of those, each department head will bring those to an assistant superintendent. Assistant superintendent meets with them and they go through and say, look at this, did we need this? They have those conversations, and there could be cuts made at that point in time. For instance, Mr. King, as an operations assistant superintendent, he meets with maintenance, he meets with transportation, he meets with food services, he meets with all those different groups. So cuts are made there. Then we take that information, whatever requests are left, and then they come forward to be presented at a separate meeting with HR director, with myself, with Mr. Golden, the assistant superintendents. And then we have those same conversations of looking at prior years, looking at the big plan of where we're headed. Is this appropriate? Can we go back and look? Is there anything we cut? And Mr. Golden will make suggestions on cuts at that point. So that is currently where we are. We're still in that process. Once we get to that, down to the numbers that we feel good about, that's what we present to you. In February, you will have that opportunity to review the document. You'll have it for a month. Ask all the questions you want to ask. Suggest what you want to suggest. In March, then we present for you what we believe would be our best recommendation for you to vote on. We have to have that document to the county commission by April 1st. So that is the timeline. That's a requirement. That's why you're getting February and March. So just so you know, if you're looking at those major categories, a lot of them are self-explanatory. And so special education, for instance, was where do we see, I had that question tonight, where can we see those expenses? And so if you're looking specifically for special education instruction, like that's 71,200. Support for special education is 72,220. So you can go to those different categories. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. This will be the beginning of the next pages behind that summary sheet. So if you'll see at the top left, you've got 71,100, which is regular instruction, and then you have all the accounts underneath regular instruction. Again, same information. That account, this page is for 71,100. The totals are those sums on that very first page. So what I try to do for you is we do a percentage change, so you can see from prior year if there's an increase or decrease. If there's a large one, I go ahead and try to give you a note out beside it to explain what it is, so you're not just wondering. Sometimes things to note, you may see 100% increase, but if the account only had $500 in it and it went to $1,000, that's really not a big deal. Don't worry so much when you're going, wow, 100% increase, or a decrease the same amount. But if it's something that I can look at and know this would cause a question for me, I'm going to go ahead and give you a note so that you don't have to kind of wait and guess of what that may be. If you're looking at the accounts, just I wrote up across the top a little hint for you. If it starts with 5-1, that's going to be related to wages. So any of the 5-1-1-6 teachers starts with a 5-1, that's going to be related to wages. 5-2 is anything with benefits, which is pensions, taxes, and insurance. And then 5-3 are all other operational expenses. And that's all I'm going to share with you guys tonight, just so when you get the document, you kind of have an idea of how to navigate it. If you have questions at any time, email me, call me, tell me you need to talk, and we'll go through it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. King.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, a couple of comments related to what Rachel's presented. Just as a reminder, I don't know, 9 or 10 days ago, I sent you all an email with some information related to what county government's doing. The mayor is aiming for a 4% pay increase, and he has told the budget committee that he wants them to find a way to be able to fund that for us as well. We don't project that we're going to get any revenue based on the information, enough revenue for that based on the information we have right now. I've also made it clear to them that I don't anticipate we will be asking for a 4% raise across the board. Whatever funding we have, we're going to apply what we're working on right now to prioritize pay increases based on that annual goal you all set for me in November. And you, of course, that's pretty recent. You may remember that. Our team is looking at our supplements. Our team is looking at some of our lower paid positions. Our team is looking at market right now. And we're also looking at 10-month versus 12-month staff members as we're evaluating that. We will bring that proposal to you in February, even without us knowing yet if we have the funding for it because of the timeline and process. The other thing I was going to mention was we really have 4 budgets that you all review. Rachel has given you information related to the general budget. We have food service budget, which is a standalone budget, and it is based on federal funding and actual revenue. It is not a tax. It is not a local tax consumer. The third one is our school-age child care program. That is also not a tax consumer. It is based on fees. And then the final one is annual capital requests that we make. And Brian is going to give you a little bit of an insight into that 4th budget in his presentation right now, in addition to some information on our 5-year cap plan.
Before we go there, Rachel, not to put you on the spot, but do we have any sense of what the additional TISA funding for the coming year might be? Any projection on that?
No, I got a bulletin yesterday that we do not have a number yet. And so I just know, based off of fiscal capacity, the anticipation is we will get our first, let me back up, we will get that first idea in February, last week of February, which will be after we've actually present the budget to you. The second piece is we will get the property tax reappraisal information in March. And so at this point in time, the Department of Education does not have any information they can give us to estimate, other than they anticipate that it obviously is not going to go down, that base is not going to go down, but they do not have an increase yet for us.
But if everything's on time, we should have it in time to vote on
For
the
the
budget
March,
in
yeah, we'll
March.
have an idea of
Okay.
them.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I do have one worry related to that. The fiscal capacity indicator that we spent time talking about last year, and some of you who are new to it have gotten a little bit of insight into that. Every year, there's a complex formula that projects out, for lack of a better phrase, the county's capacity to pay. And Williamson's fiscal capacity continues to separate from most of the rest of the state. If they continue to do that, unless there's some more revenue somewhere, we're looking at a reduction from the state. And Rachel, I may have said too much because you know it's speculative at this point.
It is speculative, but we do know that we have not been given an increase in the base yet to have any idea. Last year, that increase in base got eaten up by fiscal capacity because the fiscal capacity, once it went up, we didn't really get that much of a bump. And so that is the anticipation again for this year, considering that our numbers are also staying pretty flat.
But Jason, the reappraisal won't take effect in terms of physical capacity until the following year. Is that right? Because they won't have that done for this.
Well, right now, you're right, except that the fiscal capacity they're applying to us was not last year's, it was the year before. Am I
So-
correct on that, Rachel? Or
It's
do
a
I-
mix.
Okay.
And so we actually, though, they don't calculate the fiscal capacity until May. So it will depend on how much information they can get in. But it is a mix between Seaver and Tasser as to
Okay.
which one they use.
We don't give out draft information. No, I'm just kidding.
So no, we don't. I mean, I ask
For
periodically.
good reason, right?
Right. And that would, it would be helpful if we could actually do it a full years in advance so that we would have a better idea to estimate, but at this moment, they're not.
Gotcha, thanks.
I want that 2 days before.
Yes.
No.
Too soon.
Okay. Question, is this, in February, is that when we'll have like the update, just, because we're still getting tons of emails about this, the art teacher supplement stuff, we'll kind of
Yes.
get an update on that.
We plan to give you our proposed pay increase plan in February, with a caveat that we don't know that we have the revenue yet.
All right, Mr. King, I think we're ready for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tonight, my goal is to kind of go over the three big buckets of operation. You will see two of them in February. You will see the annual capital, and that will be the first time you've seen that. And of course, we'll have our general purpose will be part of that. And I also want to talk about the 5-year capital plan that we've already voted on, just the plan, and kind of go over the difference between the three budgets, how we kind of come up with the numbers, and the projects that we decide on working on. So first thing we'll start with is the 5-year capital plan. Y'all have already voted on the plan. You haven't voted on any money yet. And the county commission actually voted on it this past Monday as well. They approved the plan. They haven't approved any money, any intent to fund. That will come, I believe, we'll bring it probably back to the school board in March, maybe, March or April.
I'm guessing we'll do that in April so that it can go before the commission in May.
Yeah, so we will have to come back to you for a vote on the 5-year capital for the intent to fund. And so I just kind of want to go through that because I know there were lots of questions about the 5-year capital plan when we presented it to you.
And by the way, at the county commission meeting, there was discussion where they were reminding themselves of the why of the 5-year capital plan. And they mentioned that the adequate facilities tax
Correct.
requires them to do those 5-year capital plans.
Correct. And here's just some general notes, and you'll get this PowerPoint. I'm not going to read through every line, but you'll get this kind of some facts about the 5-year plan. But I am going to go through the 5 major categories of the 5-year capital plan that you voted on. The first big category is the new school construction land purchases. And you can see what we have, and this is the 5-year capital plan, by the way, that y'all have voted on a couple of months ago. Before we do any new construction and put that on the books, these are kind of the steps that we go through operationally before we even consider building a new school. First thing we do is we maximize capacity, and sometimes that's not ideal, but we'll do that before we think about building a new school. We'll put art and music maybe on carts. We'll convert some common areas into classrooms. That's kind of our first step when schools are getting close to capacity. We do open zone, which you'll see later on tonight, that schools that do have capacity will open zone to help alleviate some of that. Then we'll add portables, which we've done at Nolensville. You know, we have 3 portables at Nolensville Elementary, and then we'll rezone if we can, and then we can do additions if it's cost effective before we actually build a new school. That's kind of some of the things we look at before we actually get to building a new school. Projections, you'll get that tonight for open zone, and Allison will be dealing with a lot of this tonight, but how do we get those numbers? We roll up grade level, we look at historical growth, and Allison has all the construction numbers in different areas, permits issued, all that, and I'm going to show you an example slide of that, of stuff that she keeps up with. I did just throw this in here. This is just our growth since 2010. As you can see, we were pretty steady on rise until 2021, and then you can see where we've leveled off in the past 3 or 4 years. This is just an example of of sheets that Allison Nunley keeps, and you can see the detail, permits issued, the type of homes being built, and she has this for all municipalities. This is just one example that I got for her for the Nolensville area.
What are those, I recognize single family, TH is?
Townhome.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
And then MF?
Multifamily, yes, ma'am. And then she also has this, she has it by zone. You can see where she actually has it mapped out where homes are being built.
And some of you who've sat in on rezoning meetings, you've seen some of these with a projected number of homes in those different locations.
Any questions before we move forward? This is just a timeline, a general timeline of what it takes to build a new school. There's factors, but this is just typical.
And by the way, Lydia's going to post this on the website, so you guys will be able to access this whole thing.
So typically 2 to 3 years, depending on elementary, middle, or high, but that's typically our time range. I put this in here about additions. We have done several additions through the years at high schools and even elementaries. We've added wings. And I put a little example in here. This is rounded numbers, but just as an example, we've added on at Summit, Independence, and Ravenwood, roughly 500 extra seats at a cost of $23 million versus Nolensville High at $50 million for 17. So you can see, if it's possible, if we have the land, it is a cost-effective way to keep from building new schools. Here's just some information that Eric Gardner got to me. Well, I don't know why it jumped there. Just cost of new buildings, how it's gone up over the past 10 or 15 years. You can see the cost per square foot, how much it's grown since we built Longview Elementary.
Brian, will you go back to the previous slide, please?
Sure.
The 23 million number, that's the aggregate for the three, or is that
Yes, sir.
23 per?
No, sir. That was what it cost if you added all the
Got it.
costs for those. Yes,
That's what I thought, wanted to be
Yes,
sure.
sir. Yes, sir.
So, Brian, on the next slide,
Yes, sir.
these are, would you say that they're substantially the same building, all of these, as far as the Creekside,
Yep.
Jordan, Clover
Yes,
Cove? I
sir.
mean, they look pretty much the same from the outside, but I mean,
Yes, sir.
modifying just for the site plan.
Yes, sir.
This
Yes,
is
sir.
all the same architectural design. Now, there's little changes in between. Eric has made it a point, every time we build a new one, they do some slight improvements. There's also slight changes in the code, fire code from time to time,
Right.
but largely they're the same buildings.
And I'm not going to go through every one of these. The next big section that you'll see, I don't know why this keeps jumping, is renovations. And we have 2 renovations scheduled for this year, Hillsborough Elementary, Middle, and Grassland. And these are just some of the things that we'll do for a renovation. And I know some of you have asked that question before. May not do all of these, there may be some other things that we do a little different, but these are typically things we look at when we do renovations. Hillsborough was built in 1981, and Grassland Middle was 86, I believe. So that's the age of the schools that we're renovating for this year. Any questions? Maintenance, major projects. Now, this is where we got to get, want to do some explaining, because a lot of these roofs, HVAC, those kind of things, you're also going to see an annual capital. And that can be confusing. It's confused some of our county commissioners, think that we're asking for stuff in 2 different places. So I want to try to explain the difference. In the 5-year capital, the major projects, these are major projects. So if we talk about a roof, it's a complete roof replacement. Something in the average of 20 to 30 years before they get that. It's based on inspections and the age. Adam Christopher and maintenance, they do annual inspections to all facilities every year. So that's how this gets put in the 5-year capital. Same thing with asphalt, with the tennis repaving, the tracks. That's how these are evaluated and put in the 5-year capital, along with the HVAC units. These are not just individual units at a school. This would be a complete refresh, ductwork, all of that would be in a 5-year capital. You'll see next year we're going to ask for outdoor LED lights. That has been a big request of schools for years, and we've kicked the can, but we're going to ask for that next year, and that's going to be for all high schools to replace their outdoor lighting. And then, of course, we'll have turf fields that we already have that we'll have to replace. There's their average lifespan, and we'll have to start replacing those. And that'll be on the 5-year capital as well, although there's none in there for this year. Any questions? The next big bucket in the 5-year capital is cybersecurity and physical and cybersecurity. We're in phase 2 of replacing all key entry with fobs. That would be indoor and outdoor. And replacing the paging system with digital paging and an alert system. And we'll keep that in there. We don't know in the next 5 years what future safety initiatives could come around in the next 5 years. So Fletch and his team are always evaluating. There's so much stuff out there, and they do a really good job of kind of weeding through what would be beneficial, what would help us. And so,
Just as a quick FYI, Fletch and his team are evaluating the panic buttons. There are tons of products out there.
right.
And there's arguments on both sides of that. You know, the one key point would be they need to be usable, even though somebody might use them only once ever, right? And so he's going through that process. We don't have anything ready for you yet, but that may be something we bring to you if Fletch and his team conclude that that's our next best step, maybe in another year or so, as they're evaluating.
And that could be on the 5-year capital if we
Right.
find something like that. That could be, depending on, you know, infrastructure and what that would take. Exactly. So those are the 5 big buckets of the 5-year capital that you voted on. And again, sometime in March or April, you will be asked to vote on the intent to fund. And the intent to fund is just the first column. The rest of it's just a plan. The only thing we'll be asking for funding for is the first column in the 5-year plan.
And Brian and his team will be evaluating, double checking the need first.
Right.
And also evaluating to the extent they can, some make sure the estimates are drilled down as tight as we can.
Yes, sir. All right, we're moving on to the annual capital, and this you will see in February, along with the Rachel's budget for the general purpose budget. There's kind of 3 big buckets of our annual capital. You'll have some IT stuff in there. Most of the stuff in IT and the annual capital will be instructional stuff, such as the interactive boards that you see in this room. We're in a process of getting all the projectors taken out and replaced with interactive boards. This would include printers, I'm trying to think, battery backups, those kind of things that aren't really security, more instructional. You'll also see maintenance projects in here, which will, again, be like HVAC and some of those things, and we'll go over those as we get to them. So here's your maintenance annual capital, and you'll see the difference between this and the 5-year capital. Unforeseen projects, partial HVAC, stuff that does have age on it, but it may not be ready for a complete refresh, but because of the inspections, the degradation, Adam will put that in there for an annual capital, for a partial replacement. Same thing with, maybe there may be parts of a roof that need to be replaced, some plumbing work. This is where the Fairview project, Mr. Bosick, this was in the annual capital to help out with some of the plumbing issues last year, that he replaced the toilets and has done some work there, and also had some engineering work. That was in the annual capital. This is also where schools make their request. They turn in a form to Adam Christopher of any kind of request for their schools. and it could be sidewalks, it could be upgrades to different things. It could be the restrooms at Franklin High School, the showers, things like that go into requests to Adam Christopher. He then reviews those with the assistant superintendents of high school and second elementary, then reviews it with Mr. Golden and myself, and we kind of narrow it down. And I want you to see how we kind of get to that number and what that number starts out with, starts out like. Go ahead, yes, ma'am.
So we've got a lot of schools that are there's a big variance in
Sure.
the ages of the schools. Like we toured Fairview Elementary, which is our oldest school, and I know each principal is, I think it's in October that they're given, like, they can make a wish list. And are we giving schools that are older, maybe a little bit more wiggle room in budgeting for their needs, as opposed to brand-new schools? Do they get a bigger, I'm just trying to make it, the
Sure.
disparity kind of level back out. But are we giving those schools that are older that might have more needs, are we giving them a little more leeway in the budgeting end?
Well, it's based on needs, so typically your older schools would have more needs. Just, you know, you would hope that Creekside, we're not gonna do an HVA replacement. You know what I'm saying? So just by default, the older schools should get that. So it's based on needs, and I'm gonna kind of go through how we get there as we move forward. But yeah, keep that in mind. So the schools do send it, and it's evaluated with, excuse me. Oh, sorry, I got some. And that was the information, kind of some of the things that technology will request in annual capital. And here's the thing, it's not security, it's, you know, but these are important. I mean, this is instructional stuff. This is not stuff that, you know, some bells and whistles. I mean, these are basic things, printers and interactive panel that schools need to teach. And so sometimes it's easy to say, cut that stuff out, but it's tough. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we need if we want to keep our instruction up. So here's some historical data on what we've gotten in annual capital. If you go back to 2019, 9 million, 10 million, you can kind of see where we're at. Last year we were asked to keep it flat from the year before, so you can see we stayed at 13 million. So think about this. We got 13 million last year. What we have been requested by schools this year, just requested by schools, that was on the list, that's a legitimate request, not necessarily a safety issue, but legitimate request, is $30 million. That doesn't count IT, and it doesn't count the necessarily the stuff that Adam's asking for. We're at 30 million right now. And you can see what we historically get. We don't even get half of that for annual capital. That's just maintenance. So if you take it, of that 13 million, 5, 6, 7 million of it is IT. So that means you're left with 7, 8 million for maintenance annual capital. It doesn't leave a lot of extra for stuff other than just necessities, which is HVACs and stuff. There's just not a lot of extra to do some of the stuff that we would like to do. Yes, sir.
Are you saying then the 23-24 they requested that 13 million and that was what was approved, and this year?
Well, so a lot, and I'll be honest, a lot of this is we're told beforehand what we can ask for. So last year, for example, we were told, don't ask for more than you got last year. We're keeping everybody's capital request flat.
We
So
don't have
last year-
the revenue.
So we knew that we could only ask for 13 million. A lot of times, we're kind of given a heads up on what we can expect to get in capital. In several years, through the years, we'll ask for 13, 14 million, and they'll say, we'll give you 11. And they'll just cut $1 million or $2 million. Yeah.
Brian, can you give us an example or two of a request that was made, a few years ago that we weren't able to fund, that then resulted in increased operating expenses, and then ultimately, we replaced the item, or we actually did the item later at an increased cost. I just love to. It's more than just opportunity cost, and maybe it costs more in the beginning, but some of these things are going to cost us actually operating dollars too.
Sure. Adam, can you think of anything offhand?
That's a great one. The one that jumped to my mind was Centennial High School, some security fencing on the top slope there next to the Drury Inn. That had been requested. I think the first budgetary estimate we got from our contractor was $12,000 to run security fencing across the top of that slope. We had people coming down, vandalizing the school, damaging the brand new track, damaging the athletic turf field. They'd bring their dogs down. The dogs would dig and leave messes behind on the practice field that the kids would then end up in, and ruining their jerseys in the messes the dogs left behind, etc. It took us, I think, about 3 years to finally vet that up and be able to get the funding set aside to do that. When we finally did the project, it was about $19,000, so considerably more than the initial estimate. And then even since then, we've done some repairs on it. But I just say that was a security issue on that campus. I was glad we were able to finally get it done. We probably have 100 stories like that. I can't think of them all off the top of my head. The gas thing that Mr. Welch mentioned, certainly there are probably 100 of them like that we try to go for every year. And to the question, requested and approved from last year, the total requested before it was cut and vetted and prioritized and limited and taken down to the bare bones that they said they were gonna let us go for was more than $30 million. But a lot of those we just had to we were churning and going through on, well, is this one, which one's gonna, are we gonna prioritize out and kind of work through that? What can we live without? We go through that a lot, and that's how we end up with kind of finally what we end up getting. And we do our best with the funding that we get. Frequently, if we can get a good deal on a project, we award it and we save a little bit. Well, that lets us, use those funds to, get a couple of extra little things that maybe might enhance the schools as well. So we really work to try to maximize the value we get from the funding that we get. I hope that answers the question.
I have a quick question. So it looks like we've kind of consistent, there was a little blip in 22 to 23 when we requested 16 and got 13 million. Then in 23, 24, we requested and approved for 13 million. And then this year it's jumped to request to 30 million.
No,
So-
ma'am, we're not gonna request 30 million.
No, but I guess what I'm saying is, why was there a big increase? I understand we're not, but suddenly we needed a lot more. There was a big increase in requests.
There's actually not a big increase. Brian's 30 million is in an earlier stage in the budget process.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So if you look back at those
usually our
previous
teams-
years, yes.
Usually our teams will ask for substantially more than we actually take to you.
So typically,
Yeah.
we trim it down from
That's
30
correct.
million?
ma'am.
That is correct.
Okay.
And we'll
But
say.
yeah, that $30 million, that's typical of every year, somewhere
Okay,
between.
that
yeah.
was my question.
And so we'll ask questions like, tell us about your maintenance schedule. Can we go a little bit longer? Can you patch this, right? We'll go through that process. So the
Right.
30 million is not apples to the others.
Right.
I can tell you it was 27.9 for maintenance last year, I think was the number, before we ever came with the 8 million that was theirs, that they requested. So we had cut almost 20 million last year.
Right.
So the requested there means what was requested of the county commission,
Correct.
not what the team
Of the-
requested of us.
That
Of
is
the
correct.
board and the county commission. So even last year, you guys approved that 16, or in 22-23, you approved the 16.2. When it came to the commission, they approved only 13.
That's correct.
So, yeah, so let me, yeah, so that, I understand your confusion. Now, that last bullet, that is the request made this year to Adam from the schools. And that's typical every year. That's what that 30 million is. That's not what you're gonna see in February.
That includes proverbial wish list items that you hear that phrase. By the time it gets to you, it's needs.
Correct.
I'm going to jump in just quickly, and should have said this to start with. So when we're talking about general purpose, that is the sales tax, that's the TISA funds, that's taxes. Annual capital and 5-year capital, the commission approves that funding. They decide how they fund it, and it's either going to be through bonds. If it's new construction, it can be education impact fees, or they can use fund balance, or they make that determination. We manage the general purpose budget based off of the revenue that we receive, but then they determine how that gets funded. And they're funding parks and recs, and they're funding highways, and they're funding us, plus all of their needs. So when we make those requests, we listen to them that, hey, we're not going to have the funds, and that's why we try to keep it. We would love to be able to go request everything that we feel like we actually need, but we are realistic in that it's not going to be funded.
Any more questions? Okay. All right, we're good. GP, I'll hit this really quick. I've never gotten that from Mr. Golden before. That's interesting. I like that. Appreciate that. So we'll go quick through GP. This is just some of the highlights. You'll get the PowerPoint on kind of what's in operational GP. Won't read through all of these. You can look at it on the PowerPoint. So we'll do some maintenance work from our operational budget, but it's pretty limited as well. And that's, well, I think we're good. Yeah, I think we're good. Any questions?
So as a reminder, we will come to you with our annual capital request. It's a separate budget. That's that 13 or so that we'll take to the county commission. And I just got to be blunt. That's the one they like to tell us no on. That's right. That's a good point. I have to repeat that, Mr. Cash, because your microphone wasn't on, just so there's a record of that.
Pay me now or pay me
There you
later.
go.
Hey, Jason.
Yep.
Years ago, we had a presentation, and it was sort of what the corporate recommendation was
Ooh,
for,
yeah.
do you know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about.
And it was, the Association of Builders Contractors or something, I forget what it was, but
Yeah.
it was a sort of a national recognized association of what the industry standard for facility maintenance was, and the percentages,
Yeah.
and then we compared it to what we were, and I mean, that was staggering. That might be worth revisiting.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I remember Mark Samuels, and Brian's nodding his head too. He remembers that. We'll find that, because you're right. The capital maintenance recommendations for facilities managers is not anywhere near what we're getting.
No, it's really not.
Anything else on those items? Two things on a board chair report. One, just be reminded, the statement of interest through the Ethics Commission is due by January 31st. So if you haven't gone on the site and filled that out, you have to do that annually. That's a state requirement, not a local requirement. So Lydia can give you that information if you need it again. I know she has sent it out before. The second thing is, as a reminder, TSBA's Legislative and Legal Institute is February 10 and 11, being held in Cool Springs. That's where they do their discussion of policy, legislation. They have speakers come in from the legislature. And it's a 2-day, 1 afternoon, 1 morning, but you can get, if you do both days, you get all of your annual training hours in right there. So if you want to register for that, let Lydia know.
And Mr. Chair, it's close. It's here, I mean, it's here in our county, so.
Yeah, I
a
mean,
good
it's,
one to
I
come
did
to.
it I think the last 2 years, and it's very, I mean, if your schedule permits, it's very easy. Just, it's like 1 to 5, and then again the next morning, 8 to 10 or 8 to 11, and then you're done.
Well, it's annual. It's new information each year, so.
They count it, no matter what, they count it. 2 half days, basically. Yeah. So what? Yeah. But you can get partial hours if you just do one half or the other, right? Okay, maybe not. Okay. So inquire with Lydia if you want to register or get more info. All right, we'll move on to new business. We have only one item, but it's an important one, and that's the open and closed school zones for the coming school year. Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, board members. I gave you a little bit of information about this maybe a week and a half ahead of time, because this is one of our important annual items. Every year we make recommendations for open zone schools, and we've included some data for you. Brian mentioned it in his presentation. That's one of the ways that we manage our growth. We actually have had this process in place long before the state law has been in place, and the state law actually borrows some of the language from our policy, but they've made a couple of changes to it when they passed this law, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. The short version of it is that we have the discretion to determine how many seats, how many available seats at each school are appropriate for us to allow students to come via open zone. And we make that determination, you make that vote. We make that determination based on, of course, the number of seats available at this moment, but we also project out the window of time that a student might be there, because our board policy allows those students to stay through the end of their career at those particular schools. The state law actually doesn't require that, but we do because we think it's reasonable to, once somebody commits, allow them to stay. You have that document before you with the open zoning. It is not the only means by which students can attend a school out of zone. There's a handful of other things in board policy. If somebody moves into an area and they move out, they may be able to stay. Especially at the high school level, some of the college and career technical education programs will allow a student to attend if it's not offered at their school. So there's some other examples of it, but this is the bulk of our out of zone schools. I want to give you a little bit of a factual correction. I think in my email I told you around 2,000 students are attending a school out of zone in Williamson County. It's actually a little bit over 2,500 this year, so I was a little low. So we have had a number of students exercise that choice. You can see some of the details. Certainly open any questions that you guys may have related to that. Did want to mention one specific zone, Brentwood Middle and Brentwood High School. We are recommending open zoning that for the first time in over a decade. And it's because of us finishing the building construction at Brentwood Middle. We still have some work to do on the field in common area that will be going on in the fall. But all the work that Eric and Brian have done show that the traffic flow is going to be back to normal. We did something similar with Page High School. Some of you may recall last year where the construction wasn't quite finished, but it was good enough to where there could be a decent flow, and we open zone Page last year. So we do recommend the same thing for this year. That's really the key point. Final thing I want to mention, I think if I'm not mistaken, we have 42 of our 50 campus schools that we're recommending having some open zoning so that families can have choice.
All right, let's open it up for discussion.
Can you speak to, I've had a couple of families reach out,
thinking that this is related to the proposed voucher plan. Can you speak to that and how that this is not related?
Number one, it is not related. It by many, many years precedes that. It's a product of our planning to the extent we can, give families choice within Williamson County Schools. This is not open zone to out of county. This is open zone to our families who live in our county. There are a very small number of students who live out of our county who do attend. It's quite limited. We have a handful of families who are in the process of moving in, who have a non-contingent contract to move in, who can move in a little bit ahead of that contract closing. We do allow full-time employees to pay a tuition rate for their children to go. Beyond that, it is not in any way related to choice outside the county.
I'm gonna bring this up again because it bothers me every year is when we do this and to your point, say, you know, if you get permission to go open zoned, you're guaranteed. We essentially create super zones for these students that are out of it. And then later we do have to fill and move things around, and we have to move entire neighborhoods
Yep.
that are out of it, while, you know, kids who are coming in are not impacted.
Thank you for that.
Well, and then we also have the implication of the grandfathering policy,
Mm-hmm.
which creates generational. So this is, you know, and so then when we get to the zoning, and we all gripe about how hard this is, and we don't want to move kids and everything else, but this is just one more example where I think we create the problem in the future.
So, thank you for that. Let me put a little bit of detail in it to make sure you all grasp what Mr. Welch is talking about. Because of our existing board policy, once a student moves in out of zone, you could reasonably argue that they have a greater likelihood of staying in that school than somebody who lives there. Because if it becomes overcrowded and we have to rezone, somebody might get moved out of that zone when somebody who's attending out of zone gets to stay. And that's the point you're making. And you're right, that's
Yeah.
a part
Well,
of it.
And I'm going to say, it's not even you could argue greater likelihood. It is a greater,
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
got a
That's right.
0% chance of being moved.
That's right. Yeah, you're right about that.
Well, I guess to that point though, we build in some growth, and I mean we're not open zoning 100% of most of these vacancies, and so and on the chart in our packet there are you know we've got people that are being zoned in and out of almost every school. So I mean the net effect is much less than the 2,500 students over all of our schools. It's really a much smaller number
Per year.
No, this is not per year.
yeah,
I mean
this is this year.
this is each year, whatever. I mean, so, but it's just the actual number for this year. But I mean, the net number of, you'd have to look at each school and its net out of zone. So both out and in, and how, I mean, by grade level, I mean, it's really kind of negligible, and it serves such a great purpose for parents to be able to make the decision to seek to I mean, so many different reasons, for curriculum, for you know, all kinds of social reasons, parenting situations. Like, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why people use these. But my question was around the process, Jason, of if, you know, some of these have of relatively small numbers, and in some cases the open spots that were filled last year is greater than the number of spots that, like I was looking at Franklin High School, that greater than the number of spots that are available. So if we can explain, and maybe this is a time to explain on Monday night, maybe better than tonight, about the process for, you know, hey, after we approve these things, what are we kicking off the process in terms of the lottery system now, instead of the old system. I guess that's been in
Yeah.
place for the last 2 years.
Well, thank you for that. And yeah, so the state included a lottery system where instead of being first come, first served, there's a window of time where families can submit the form and request it. That window closes, if I'm not mistaken, on April 15th. It cannot open until 2 weeks after you vote for open zone. For whatever reason, that's just the state rule. And if more families or more students choose open zone than we have available seats, we're required to do a lottery. We actually did a lottery last year for Franklin High School based on, I think there being 2 over or maybe 3 over our total, somewhere around there. And enough families said, no, never mind, I don't want it, that we ended up not actually having to implement the lottery work we did. But that could happen. So that's that process. To answer your other question related to numbers, Allison does her projections. We look at trends for that particular school. We look at offerings through which students can get access other than open zoning. Franklin is particular and peculiar in that we have our International Baccalaureate program there. And so students can get in there outside the open zoning. So Franklin is different from the others. We've also had a history of the numbers of students choosing Franklin to be very close to our limit. So that's why it's less than it was last year, because we have had that growth. And I tell you, we've had a lot of discussions about the Brentwood schools because it's been so long since they've been open zone. We're very curious to see what's going to happen. And to our discussion earlier, we know about Nolensville Elementary School and it being over capacity. Dr. Johnson, I'm going to mention a conversation you and I had about encouraging folks to consider the neighboring schools there. For example, we are recommending open zoning both Sunset Elementary and Jordan. And so that might be an opportunity for families there. At the moment, Tim, if you could pull up the second document that's attached there, I'd like you guys to see what I think of as the old 1970s road map. If you remember the distance from city to city. Dan, you may remember, you and I may be the only ones, I don't know, who can remember the old road map where it shows the distance from one place to the other. The top of this chart shows the number of students, the schools the students are zoned to attend, and the left shows the students they are attending. You can see that ratio that Jay was talking about of how many are zoned to that school but are attending a different school and vice versa. At the moment, Nolensville happens to be 40 to 20. 40 students who are zoned to Nolensville are attending elsewhere. That's mitigated the overcrowding a little bit because there's 20 out of zone who are attending there. Allison, is there any detail you can add to the question Mr. Galbraith asked about Franklin High?
I will just kind of give an overall explain the process. It is an online application. When the applications come in, the parents receive an automated email that says, we've received your application. After my staff processes the application, they'll get an email that says, or a text that says, your application is now in the lottery queue, and we'll run the lottery the week of after April 16th, or on April 16th. Because we have to come in on April 16th and process the applications that came in on the 15th, right? So then everything sits in the queue, and then we go through, and Mr. King can attest to this. We hit a button, and it runs a random lottery. So it's really pretty cool, and then we go through, we check, we make sure everything looks okay, and then it will send notification to the parents, and they'll go in and accept or decline their seat. So that's how, if some parents have decided, well, maybe they got into Centennial and Franklin High, so they make their choice and they decline their seat, and then someone else can get in off the wait list.
To that point, we do have families submit out-of-zone requests for multiple schools.
Yes. Yes.
Can you speak to the philosophy behind whether the question is really in regards to the number of spaces that are being reserved for open enrollment? Well, no, sorry. The number of spaces that are being reserved for growth, reserved enrollment / growth spaces, that column.
Sure.
So just for example, Allendale at the top of the list, because it's at the top, you're holding 200, proposing to hold 200. in open zone 152, but the demand last year was only 16.
Yeah.
So is the number more a function of the demand, or is it more a function of keeping a certain percentage of the seats in the school held for future growth?
It's more, it is not very much at all a function of demand. If we're on the edge and we see some demand, we might say maybe we can stretch it and push it a little bit. But it's largely driven by, in the examples of the elementary schools, we have a 6-year window to project how much space we'll have. We factor in what we know about construction projects. We factor in what we know about the history, and we will make spots available. To your point, realistically, there's no way 152 families are going to choose to go to Allendale out of zone, but we've determined that in keeping with the spirit of the state law, it's appropriate to leave those, because we know that 200 seats, based on what we know about Allendale's future in the next 6 years, is appropriate. Oh, Allison actually just texted me, and she was giving me a correction. We can't approve out of zones on CTE programs of study. They have to go open zone. Now, there's IB is an exception.
Correct.
Thank you for that clarification.
Wait a second, is that, say that again? So if so, I did not know that was the case. I thought the exact opposite.
When the state changed this law for open zoning, and it says if a school has space, you have to open zone, that took away the option to do CTE programs of study.
So somebody can't go to Franklin specifically, like in addition to IB, they can't go use the auto body shop or go to the Aero Systems or one of the culinary programs.
So they're competing because of the state law. Thank you for that. I'd forgotten about this. Because of the state law, they're required to compete with everybody else for those spots. Now, we have a fail-safe, and it's the Zoning Appeals Committee. What I have seen, I'll give you a couple of examples. Student moves in, they've got a year of German, and Independence has German, but there's no seats available at Independence, and we want to make sure that they have that opportunity to finish their area of concentration. That will go to the Appeals Committee. And there's probably some CCTE programs where there's some similar issues. So that's our fail-safe. For good or bad, that's where we are.
This is not necessarily part of this discussion, but it's related, and that is just the trends over time of where we've seen the growth and where we haven't seen the growth. We talk about this multiple times a year, but consistently we see a few of these western half of the county elementary schools not growing and staying at significant capacity. But conversely, Arrington Elementary, I didn't really realize that how much it had grown, but that school opened 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, you're projecting it to be at 85% capacity starting the next school year.
That's right.
I think that's eye-opening.
And to your point about trends, 20 years ago, we were everywhere they could run sewer, we were seeing growth. And now it's in spots.
I was kind of fascinated with that, and I kind of did a little deep dive talking about that, because I looked up Fieldstone Farms, because we've talked about in the meetings how Walnut Grove there's a lot of capacity there. There's a lot of capacity at Hunter's Bend and Grassland. And so I kind of did some research, and Fieldstone Farms, they got approval in 1987. And so, interestingly enough, Scales was built in 1977. And so there was this projection of this massive development. And so we built Walnut Grove in 1990. And in 1992, Grassland was built and opened. And in 1995, so in 5 years, we put 3 elementary schools right there all within, a couple miles of each other.
Your point is good and well made, but Grassland was a rebuild, just so you know. So it was two.
No, wait, say that again?
Grassland Elementary was a rebuild. Grassland Elementary was there before then, but your
When
point
was
is
the
still well
Grassland
made.
then, because I got this data from the district.
Yeah, it's the construction date for that building. There was an old building there,
So
at a
when
different
did when
location.
did Grassland open?
Grassland proper? Oh my. I'm
It's
gonna
old, I think.
say, yeah,
In the
80 years
50s,
maybe?
in the 50s at least.
50s,
Okay,
so,
so
yeah,
then-
70, 80 years. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
But
So-
that building opened in 92, and to your point, the capacity's higher than the old building.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I saw a lot of,
Yeah.
then for Walnut Grove and Hunter's Bend, and still,
But your point's well made.
yeah, I call it the Fieldstone effect.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. And Fieldstone, there's not been a lot of turnover in homes. Fieldstone is full, it's just that not a lot of people are selling.
But we've seen that we saw it in Brentwood 40 years later.
That's right.
That you have the gentrification and now, the new people coming in there aren't, are 30, 40, 50 years younger than the ones that are,
Yeah.
they're leaving or dying. So, I mean, it's just a matter of time, it's just what do we do in the meantime is
That's
the
right.
question.
Well, it's to the point where, why do we need capital for construction when you said, well, it's not 100% capacity across the district?
Yeah, we're limited on how far we can bus a student in the window of time we have. That's our challenge. And so we are in the process of reviewing options for rezoning. But we know that there are some practical limitations on that. But before we come to you with a request for actual funding for a new building, we will be doing that, and we'll have that conversation with you.
But, the
So-
reality is there's just a couple of trigger points, though. I mean, the
That's
thing is, you've got 2 or 3 elementary schools that are at capacity or will be in short order.
Mhm.
And then a handful that'll never be. I mean, realistically, will never even be 70% capacity. So but then it begs the question, if you've got to move kids out of a certain school, where can they realistically go? And there's only so many places they can realistically go.
That's right. Well, and to your point, Nolensville and the Arrington area are our pain points right now. We anticipate Spring Hill is gonna come behind that, with, new June Lake development.
Yeah, so that begged the question, I did notice that Amanda H. North has 106, it's proposed to have 106 open zone spots, and, you all are the experts, but it just begs the question, do we not propose as many, just knowing that those communities are coming along?
Yeah. We actually, in this year's 5-year capital plan, pushed back to a later date all of our buildings except the northeast middle school. And so we do anticipate, as we look at this annually, some of those dates are gonna get pushed back.
And, I mean, just using these numbers for that middle school, the 3 middle schools in that area between Mill Creek, Sunset's got capacity, Mill Creek's over, and Woodland is 10 from capacity.
10 people.
10
10
people,
students.
right, yeah, so, but I mean, the net is like 25, we got 25 open seats between those 3,
That's
and we're
right.
talking about building a school that's gonna open in 3 years.
That's right.
So,
And Page is at capacity,
Yep.
Page Middle.
right.
Yeah. The nearest middle school with any significant amount of capacity is Legacy. Right? And we'll look at that.
But that's an easy drive. I'm sure, I know all my Nolensville, Ravenwood people would love to go to Legacy.
I mean, to that point, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this now, because we're going to talk about it, I know, lots more times, but those 3 middle schools that are at capacity or over, Page, Mill Creek, Woodland, where is the logical today, before the Jordan Middle School opens in 3 years, if it does, where's the relief valve?
At the moment, the nearest geographical relief valve is Legacy.
It's the only really,
It's the only-
realistically,
it's
it's
the
the
only
only
existing
one.
one,
Yeah.
yes.
One idea I'd like to throw out there is Jordan Elementary has 93. Could we potentially look at sending some sixth graders there, you know, as a short term? Or making it a K-6 instead of or I think they have pre-K, don't they? Pre-K-6.
Yes, and we move the
So-
pre-K around based on capacity from time to time. We've had some preliminary discussions about that in different spots in different contexts. We've even looked at some, from time to time, we might ask ourselves, could we take 2 elementary schools and make one a K-3 and another one a 4-6? So we're brainstorming those. We're not at a point where we recommend that, but we've seen that kind of thing. I've seen some of our neighboring counties have done that from time to time, for various reasons. So that discussion will be had.
And while I have you, if I could get the number of students who would need to take advantage of open zone at Nolensville Elementary so we could get rid of the portables.
Okay, we'll work on that. The challenge is classes,
I know.
right?
But if we have an
Yeah.
estimate, maybe we
Yeah.
can do a.
A drive.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right. We'll try to get you that.
But then if a significant number of them were to choose Jordan, then that sort of takes away the opportunity you just mentioned about sixth grade. So that's another wrinkle in the plan, but, yeah.
Another big issue with sixth grade is extracurricular activities, right? So there's some complexities to it.
So, any more questions on that? So, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but the only thing on Tuesday night, aside from the consent agenda, that this board will be voting on is this open zone plan.
That's correct.
So is everyone clear on that? One voting item Tuesday night, aside from consent, and it's this plan. Okay, so a light agenda. All right. Anything else? All right, we're adjourned. Thank you.